It's 1870, and you're standing on the endless Texas plains as the sun bleeds orange across the horizon. The air smells of sage and dust, with that peculiar silence that comes just before nightfall, broken only by the distant cry of a coyote and the rhythmic creak of a windmill spinning lazily in the evening breeze. This is beautiful country, no doubt about it, but it's also deadly. Out here, your nearest neighbor might be 10 miles away across rattlesnake-infested prairie. The closest town? Maybe a 3-day ride through territory where Comanche war parties still painted their faces for raids, where outlaws like Sam Bass and his gang might appear on the horizon like dust devils, and where a single wildfire could consume everything you'd worked years to build. But here's what's fascinating, and what Hollywood never shows you. The families who survived out here didn't just rely on 6-shooters and grit. They turned their humble log cabins and sod houses into something far more ingenious. We're talking about homes with secret rooms where entire families could vanish in seconds, outhouses that doubled as hidden arsenals, kitchen floors that could drop unwanted visitors into underground tunnels, even chamber pots rigged to explode. These weren't just houses. They were puzzles wrapped in wood and stone, designed to confuse, trap, and eliminate threats while appearing perfectly innocent to the casual observer. Tonight, we're going to explore features so strange, so cleverly twisted, that modern building codes would arrest you just for thinking about them. From Bible corners that could stop bullets to wells that were actually death traps in disguise, we'll walk through homes where every board, every brick, every piece of furniture might hide a deadly secret. Because on the Texas frontier, the difference between living and dying often came down to how well you could turn your own home against those who meant you harm. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let me tell you about the most dangerous homes in American history, where families didn't just survive the Wild West, they outsmarted it, one hidden weapon at a time. Part 1. Hidden defenses in the home. The first thing you need to understand about a Texas frontier home is that nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, was quite what it seemed. Every shadow might conceal a gun barrel. Every floorboard might hide an escape route. Every piece of furniture might be the difference between life and death when the shooting started. Let me tell you about the Henderson family's place, built outside Abilene in 1878. Tom Henderson was a practical man, a former soldier who'd seen enough of war to know that peace was always temporary. His wife Sarah had grown up hearing stories of families who'd been caught unprepared, and she wasn't about to let that happen to her children. Together, they built something that looked, from a distance, like any other homestead on the Texas plains. There was the main cabin, built of sturdy oak logs chinked with mud and moss, a small barn that housed their 2 horses, and a milk cow. A vegetable garden where Sarah coaxed tomatoes and beans from the reluctant soil. A chicken coop that was perpetually under assault from foxes and coyotes. And there, at the back of the property, what appeared to be an ordinary root cellar, the kind every frontier family needed to keep their food cool in the brutal Texas summers. But step closer to that root cellar, and you'd notice details that didn't quite add up. The stone steps leading down were just a little too wide enough for a family to move quickly, even in darkness. The wooden doors seemed unusually thick, reinforced with iron bands that looked decorative but were actually functional. The little mound of earth above the cellar was carefully shaped and planted with prairie grass that would hide its true size from casual observers. And if you looked very carefully, which most visitors never did, you might spot something peculiar about the foundation stones. Small holes, barely visible unless you knew where to look, drilled with the precision of a master craftsman. Those holes weren't accidents, they weren't decorative. They were rifle ports. Because this wasn't just a root cellar. It was the Henderson family's panic room, their final line of defense, their underground fortress where they could disappear completely and fight back from a position of strength. Root cellar panic rooms. Sarah Henderson had learned early that the frontier didn't forgive the unprepared. She'd heard the stories that every frontier wife whispered to her friends. Stories of families found days later, scattered across their homesteads like broken dolls, victims of their own naive trust in the goodness of human nature. When her husband built their homestead, she insisted on something most wives never thought to ask for, a place where the whole family could disappear if danger came calling. And in 1870s Texas, danger had a habit of announcing itself with war whoops, gunfire, and the smell of smoke on the wind. Tom Henderson, being a practical man and a loving husband, didn't argue. He'd spent 3 years fighting in the Civil War, and he understood something that many frontier men refuse to acknowledge. Sometimes the best strategy wasn't to stand and fight. Sometimes it was to vanish completely. Let your enemies waste their time and energy looking for ghosts, and then strike when they least expected it. The root cellar they built was a marvel of desperate engineering. The walls were constructed of limestone blocks, each one carefully fitted and mortared, creating barriers 3 feet thick that could stop not just rifle bullets but even small cannonballs if it came to that. The ceiling was reinforced with oak beams salvaged from an old barn, strong enough to support the weight of horses if raiders decided to stable their mounts directly above the hidden family. The space inside was carefully calculated, just large enough for 7 people to hide comfortably, with room for essential supplies. Sarah had measured it herself, using her children as test subjects, making sure that even if they had to spend days underground, they could do so without going insane from claustrophobia. The walls were whitewashed to reflect the dim light from carefully concealed oil lamps, and the floor was covered with thick rugs that would muffle any sound. But here's where it gets really interesting. Those rifle ports I mentioned weren't just holes in the stone. They were carefully angled, using principles Tom had learned during his military service, so that someone inside could have a clear field of fire across the entire area around the cabin. More importantly, they were positioned so that multiple defenders could coordinate their fire, creating overlapping fields of death that would make it nearly impossible for attackers to approach the house without being seen and shot. The entrance to the cellar was a masterpiece of camouflage. What looked like an ordinary woodpile, the kind every frontier family kept for winter heating, was actually a carefully constructed facade. The logs were real, but they were mounted on a frame that could be moved by a single person who knew the secret. A hidden lever, disguised as just another piece of wood, would release the entire structure, revealing the cellar entrance underneath. Sarah had practiced this routine with her children until it became as natural as breathing. At the first sign of trouble, riders on the horizon moving too fast, gunshots in the distance, or even just that peculiar feeling that something wasn't right, the family would implement what they called the vanishing. The children would sprint from wherever they were in the house, through the kitchen, out the back door, and to the woodpile. Sarah would be right behind them, carrying the family's most precious possessions, their land deed, what little money they had, and Tom's service revolver. Tom would stay behind just long enough to grab extra ammunition and to set what he called the signals. Subtle rearrangements of furniture and objects that would tell him, when he returned, whether the house had been searched and by whom. Then, he too would disappear through the woodpile and into the earth. The transition from the bright Texas sunshine to the cool darkness of the cellar was always jarring. Your eyes would need a moment to adjust, and in that moment of blindness, you'd be overwhelmed by the sensory experience. The temperature would drop by 20 degrees. The air would smell of earth and stone, with undertones of the preserved food stored on the shelves. There was always the faint scent of gun oil because Tom religiously cleaned and maintained the weapons they kept down there. And underneath it all was something else. The smell of fear, of families who had hidden in this space before, leaving their own invisible mark on the atmosphere. The walls were lined with shelves, and Sarah had stocked them with the care of a woman who understood that they might be the difference between life and death. Canned peaches and preserved pears that she'd put up herself during the brief Texas fruit season. Sacks of dried beans and corn that could be prepared without cooking if necessary. Salt pork wrapped in oiled cloth. Smoked to the point where it would last months without spoiling. Hardtack biscuits that could break your teeth but would keep you alive. And always, always, enough water for at least a week. But mixed in with the food were the instruments of war. Boxes of ammunition for Tom's Springfield rifle and Sarah's smaller carbine. Powder and shot for the old musket that had belonged to Tom's father. A collection of pistols and revolvers, each one cleaned, loaded, and ready to use. There were knives for close work, and even a few hatchets that could serve as weapons if the situation became desperate. The children each had their assigned places in the cellar. Mary, the oldest at 14, was responsible for the youngest, little Billy, who was only 5. She would keep him quiet and calm, no matter what they might hear above. The twins, Sarah and Samuel, 9 years old, and already showing the independence that frontier life bred into children, had the job of managing the oil lamps and keeping watch through the rifle ports. And what they might see through those ports could be terrifying. Picture it. You're crouched in the darkness, peering through a hole barely 2 inches wide, watching your home being violated by strangers. You can see their faces clearly, close enough to count their teeth when they laugh at some joke you can't hear. You watch them kick over your furniture, searching for hidden valuables. You see them paw through your mother's dresses, looking for jewelry or money sewn into the fabric. You watch them examine your father's tools, testing the weight of his hammer, the sharpness of his saw, deciding what's worth stealing. The psychological impact was intense. You were simultaneously completely vulnerable, trapped underground with no escape route except back through the house that was currently occupied by armed men, and perfectly positioned to strike back. Those rifle ports meant that you could put a bullet through any of the intruders, without them having any idea where the shot came from. Tom Henderson had planned for this carefully. The ports were positioned so that the muzzle flash would be nearly invisible from outside, especially in daylight. More importantly, they were angled so that you could fire from deep within the cellar, making it almost impossible for return fire to find its target. An attacker might see the puff of smoke, but they'd have no clear shot at the person who had just tried to kill them. But the real genius wasn't in the engineering. It was in the psychology. Tom understood that most raiders were opportunists, looking for easy targets and quick scores. They weren't military units prepared for extended sieges. When gunfire started coming from invisible positions, when their companions started dropping without any clear enemy to shoot back at, most of them would decide that this particular homestead wasn't worth the risk. The Henderson family used their cellar for real just once, and that single experience validated every hour Tom had spent digging, every dollar Sarah had spent on extra ammunition, every drill they'd put the children through. It was the spring of 1879, and Texas was going through one of its periodic outlaw epidemics. The Rangers were spread thin, dealing with troubles along the Mexican border, and word had gotten out that the area around Abilene was full of isolated homesteads with no law enforcement for 100 miles in any direction. A gang calling themselves the Red River Raiders had been working their way across North Texas, hitting remote farms and ranches with a simple strategy: show up with overwhelming force, take whatever wasn't nailed down, and disappear back into the wilderness before anyone could organize pursuit. The Henderson family first heard about the raiders from a neighbor, Jacob Patterson, who'd ridden over to warn them that the gang had hit the Morrison place just 15 miles to the east. The Morrison family had tried to fight back and had paid for their courage with their lives. Patterson had found them 3 days later, and what he'd seen had shaken him badly enough that he couldn't bring himself to describe it in front of the women and children. That night, Tom and Sarah made their decision. They would implement the vanishing at the first sign of trouble, and this time, it wouldn't be a drill. The trouble came 2 days later, just after dawn. Samuel, who'd been out doing the morning chores, came running back to the house with news that made everyone's blood run cold. 6 riders were approaching from the east, moving fast and hard with the kind of purpose that meant they weren't just passing through. Sarah felt her heart start hammering, but her hands remained steady as she began the routine they'd practiced so many times. "Children," she said, her voice calm and level, "we're going to play the hiding game now. Remember the rules." The rules were simple. Move quickly but quietly. Take nothing except what you could carry easily. And once you were in the cellar, complete silence no matter what you heard above. The children responded like the well-trained frontier kids they were. Mary scooped up Billy. The twins gathered the emergency supplies Sarah had always kept ready, and within 90 seconds the family had vanished completely. From their hidden rifle ports, they watched the Red River Raiders approach their home. 6 men, just as Samuel had reported, armed with rifles and pistols, wearing the kind of clothes that suggested they'd been living rough for weeks. The leader was a tall, thin man with a beard that hadn't seen scissors in months, and eyes that moved constantly, taking in every detail of the Henderson homestead. Tom recognized the type immediately. These weren't desperate farmers driven to crime by hard times. These were predators, men who had chosen violence as a profession and had gotten very good at it. Through the rifle port, he could see the leader making hand signals to his men, positioning them around the house with the efficiency of a military unit. These men had done this before, many times. What followed was one of the longest days in the Henderson family's life. They watched through their rifle ports as the raiders systematically searched their home, looking for anything of value. They saw their furniture overturned, their personal belongings scattered, their carefully maintained household turned into chaos. But, most terrifying of all, they could hear the raiders talking, discussing what they'd found and what they planned to do next. "Folks can't have gone far," the leader said, his voice carrying clearly through the thin cabin walls. "Fire's still warm. Breakfast is still on the table. They probably saw us coming and ran for the hills." "Should we go after them?" one of the others asked. "No need," the leader replied. "They'll come back eventually, and when they do, they'll find a little surprise waiting for them." Tom felt his blood turn to ice water as he realized what the man was talking about. The raiders weren't just planning to rob the place. They were planning to wait for the family to return, to ambush them when they thought it was safe. For the next 6 hours, the Henderson family remained absolutely still in their underground hiding place while 6 armed killers made themselves at home above them. They could hear boots walking back and forth across their floor. They could hear the raiders eating their food, drinking their precious whiskey, even using their furniture for target practice. At one point, one of the men walked directly over the hidden entrance to the cellar, and Tom had to put his hand over Billy's mouth to keep the 5-year-old from crying out in fear. But as the day wore on, the raiders grew bored and careless. They'd found some of Tom's whiskey, and frontier outlaws weren't known for their discipline when it came to alcohol. By late afternoon, Tom could tell from the sound of their voices that most of them were drunk. That's when he made his decision. The first shot came from the rifle port that covered the front approach to the house. Tom had been watching the leader, who was sitting on the front porch, cleaning his pistol, and when the man stood up to stretch, Tom put a bullet through his chest from a range of about 30 feet. The shot was so unexpected, so completely without warning, that the leader was dead before he hit the ground. The psychological effect on the remaining raiders was exactly what Tom had hoped for. Suddenly, gunfire was coming from an invisible enemy. Their leader was dead, and they had no idea where the shooter was hidden. From their perspective, Tom Henderson and his family had somehow managed to sneak back to their homestead and set up an ambush. But Tom wasn't done. The second shot came from a different rifle port, this one covering the side of the house where 2 of the raiders had taken cover. Sarah, who'd been a crack shot since childhood, put her bullet through the shoulder of a man trying to peer around the corner of the house. Her target screamed and dropped his rifle, rolling on the ground in pain. The remaining 3 raiders were now in full panic. They were taking fire from multiple directions, from enemies they couldn't see, and they had no clear line of retreat. 2 of them tried to make a run for their horses, and Tom dropped one of them with a shot to the back. The other made it to his mount, but caught a bullet from Sarah as he tried to climb into the saddle. The last raider, showing more sense than his companions, threw down his weapons and started shouting that he surrendered. Tom and Sarah held their fire, but they remained in their hidden positions. This could be a trick. It wasn't. The surviving raider was a young man, probably no more than 20, and the sudden, brutal destruction of his gang had broken his nerve completely. He stood in the middle of the Hendersons' yard, hands raised high, begging for mercy from enemies he couldn't see. Tom finally emerged from the cellar, rifle trained on the young outlaw, and the man nearly fainted when he realized that the deadly accurate gunfire had been coming from underground. When the rest of the Henderson family appeared, seemingly from nowhere, the raider's face went white with shock and something that might have been superstitious fear. They tied him to a tree and sent Samuel riding for the nearest ranger station, which was still 2 days away. The raider spent those 2 days staring at the hidden entrance to the root cellar, probably wondering what other secrets the Henderson homestead might contain. When the rangers finally arrived, he confessed to everything, probably hoping that cooperation would save him from whatever dark magic the Henderson family might have used to defeat his gang. Word of the Henderson family's victory spread quickly through the frontier community, but Tom was smart enough to understand that their defensive system would only work if it remained secret. He swore the rangers to secrecy about the details, and whenever neighbors asked how he'd managed to defeat 6 armed outlaws, he just smiled and said he'd gotten lucky. But other frontier families got the message. Within a year, there were at least a dozen root cellar panic rooms being dug in the area around Abilene, each one designed with the same deadly efficiency that had saved the Henderson family. The word spread quietly from neighbor to neighbor that there were ways to survive on the frontier that didn't depend on luck or the speed of your draw. The psychological impact on the children was something that Sarah worried about for years afterward. They'd spent an entire day watching their home being violated, listening to men discuss their family's murder, and then witnessing the violent deaths of 5 human beings. But frontier children were tough, and they understood that their father and mother had done what was necessary to protect their family. Mary Henderson, who'd been 14 during the attack, grew up to become a school teacher and eventually wrote a memoir about frontier life that included a chapter about their family's underground war. She described the experience as terrifying, but also strangely empowering. The knowledge that her family hadn't been helpless victims, that they'd been able to turn the tables on men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. The root cellar continued to serve the Henderson family for another 15 years, though they never had to use it in combat again. Word had gotten out, in the careful way that information spread through frontier communities, that the Henderson place was not a safe target. Other outlaws looking for easy prey found softer targets elsewhere, false walls and secret rooms. But not every frontier family had the time, resources, or suitable terrain to dig an underground fortress. For them, the solution was often hidden in plain sight, built right into the walls of their homes using techniques that would have made medieval castle builders proud. The technique was called double wall construction, and it was far more common than most historians realize. The basic principle was simple. Instead of building a cabin with single log walls, you created an inner wall and an outer wall with a gap between them. From the outside, the cabin looked normal, perhaps even small and humble, but inside, the family had created hidden spaces where people could disappear completely. Let me tell you about the McAllister family who settled near Fort Worth in 1875. Patrick McAllister was an Irish immigrant who'd worked as a carpenter in Boston before deciding to try his luck in Texas. His wife, Margaret, had grown up listening to her grandfather's stories about hiding from English soldiers in the Irish countryside, and she understood better than most the value of invisible refugees. Their cabin appeared, from both the outside and the inside, to be a simple, one-room log structure, about 20 feet square, typical for a family just starting out on the frontier. The logs were well fitted, the chinking was neat and professional, and the single window and door were placed exactly where you'd expect them to be. Visitors would see a table, chairs, a bed in one corner, and a fireplace that provided both heat and cooking facilities. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. But what visitors couldn't see was that the interior walls were actually about 6 inches closer to the center of the room than they should have been. Those 6 inches, multiplied by the perimeter of the cabin, created a hidden space that ran around the entire interior of the house. A narrow corridor that a person could crawl through, moving from one side of the cabin to the other without being seen from the main room. Access to this hidden space was through panels that looked like permanent parts of the wall but could actually be removed by someone who knew the secret. Margaret had designed the system herself, using techniques her grandfather had described for hiding from British tax collectors. One panel was hidden behind the bed, disguised as just another section of log wall. Another was concealed behind the fireplace, where the shadows would hide any irregularities in the chinking. But here's what made the McAllister system truly ingenious. The hidden spaces weren't just for hiding people. They were functional rooms in their own right. Patrick had built shelves into the walls, creating storage for weapons, ammunition, food, and valuables. There were even small oil lamps that could be lit without the light being visible from the main room. More importantly, the hidden corridors were equipped with observation ports, tiny holes, no bigger than a knot in a log, that allowed someone hidden in the walls to see everything happening in the main room. These ports were positioned at eye level and angled so that they provided complete coverage of the interior space. A person hiding in the walls could monitor multiple intruders, track their movements, and even coordinate defensive actions. The psychological effect of this arrangement was profound. From the perspective of someone in the main room, the cabin felt normal, even cozy. But for the hidden occupants, it was like being inside a watchtower, observing everything while remaining completely invisible. The sensory experience was intense. You could hear every word spoken, every footstep, even the breathing of the people you were watching, the smell of their tobacco, their sweat, even their fear. Everything carried through the thin wall that separated hunter from hunted. But the McAllister system had one more trick that pushed it beyond simple concealment into active defense. Those observation ports could also serve as gun ports. The holes were just large enough for the barrel of a rifle or pistol, and they were positioned so that someone hidden in the walls could cover the entire main room with deadly accurate fire. The genius was in the angles. Patrick had calculated the position so that multiple defenders could coordinate their fire without shooting each other, creating a crossfire pattern that would make it nearly impossible for anyone in the main room to find cover. Even better, the muzzle flashes would be hidden inside the walls, making it almost impossible for targets to identify where the shots were coming from. The McAllister family system was tested on a cold February night in 1876, and the results were both terrifying and effective. Margaret had been alone in the cabin with her 3 children. Patrick was in Fort Worth, buying supplies for the spring planting, when they heard horses approaching. It was nearly midnight, far too late for any legitimate visitor, and the horses were being ridden hard, as if the riders were in a hurry. Margaret knew immediately that this meant trouble. She gathered the children, ages 6, 8, and 10, and quickly ushered them into the hidden corridor behind the bed. The space was cramped, barely tall enough for the children to sit upright, but it was completely invisible from the main room. Margaret herself took position behind the fireplace panel, where she could observe the entire cabin and, if necessary, defend her family. The 3 men who broke down their door were clearly not casual thieves. They moved with military precision, searching the cabin systematically and communicating with hand signals rather than speech. These were professionals, men who had done this kind of work before and knew how to do it quietly and efficiently. What they were looking for became clear when their leader started examining the fireplace and the areas around the windows. These men weren't just looking for valuables. They were looking for hiding places. They suspected that the family might be concealed somewhere in the cabin, and they were conducting a methodical search to find them. Margaret watched through her observation port as one of the men began testing the walls, tapping on the logs to check for hollow spaces. Her heart was pounding so hard she was afraid the men might hear it, but she forced herself to remain absolutely still. In the corridor behind her, the children were doing the same, following the discipline she drilled into them through countless practice sessions. The man searching the walls was getting closer to the fireplace panel when his companion made a discovery that changed everything. He'd found Patrick's emergency cash reserve, $20 in gold coins that had been hidden under a loose floorboard. To men who'd been living rough for weeks or months, $20 was a significant score, enough to make them careless about conducting a more thorough search. But the leader wasn't satisfied. He was convinced that the family was hidden somewhere in the cabin, and he wasn't going to leave without finding them. He ordered his men to start tearing the place apart, ripping up floorboards, and examining every inch of the structure. That's when Margaret made her decision. She couldn't risk them discovering the children, and she could see that they weren't going to give up their search. Through her observation port, she could see all 3 men clearly, and she had a clean shot at each of them. The first shot came from the fireplace panel, and it took the leader center mass at a range of about 8 feet. The .44 caliber bullet from Margaret's revolver hit him with enough force to lift him off his feet and slam him against the far wall. He was dead before his body hit the floor. The psychological effect on the other 2 men was devastating. They'd been in the middle of tearing apart a presumably empty cabin when gunfire erupted from the wall itself. Their leader was dead, and they had no idea where the shooter was hidden. From their perspective, the cabin had suddenly come alive and started killing them. The second shot came from a different angle. Margaret had moved to another observation port while the surviving intruders were still trying to process what had happened to their leader. This shot took one of the remaining men in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his rifle. He screamed more from shock than pain and started firing his pistol wildly at the walls, trying to hit an enemy he couldn't see. The third man had more sense. He grabbed his wounded companion and dragged him toward the door, shouting that the place was haunted, that the walls themselves were shooting at them. They fled into the night, leaving their leader's body and their wounded pride behind. Margaret remained hidden in the walls for another hour, listening for any sign that the men might return with reinforcements. Only when she was absolutely certain that they were gone did she emerge from her hiding place and let the children out of their cramped refuge. The body of the dead intruder remained in their cabin until Patrick returned 3 days later. Margaret had been afraid to move it, uncertain whether it might be some kind of trap, and she wanted her husband to see the evidence of what had happened. When Patrick saw the scene, the torn-up cabin, the blood on the walls, and his wife's calm description of the night's events, he understood that their defensive system had worked exactly as intended. But he also understood that they'd been lucky. The intruders had been looking for a family to rob, not a fortress to assault. Next time, they might face enemies who were better prepared for the unexpected. That's when Patrick began work on the next phase of the McAllister home defense system, the escape tunnels, trapdoor kitchens, and escape beds. The kitchen was the heart of any frontier home, the place where families spent most of their waking hours. It was where meals were cooked over open fires, where children did their lessons by lamplight, where parents planned the next day's work and worried about the future. But it was also the most dangerous room in the house during an attack. The kitchen fire created light that could be seen for miles across the dark prairie, advertising the family's presence to anyone who might be watching. The smells of cooking food, bacon frying, bread baking, coffee boiling, carried even further on the night wind, drawing both welcome and unwelcome visitors. And, because the kitchen was typically at the center of the home's activities, it was where families were most likely to be caught off guard when trouble arrived. Smart frontier families solved this problem by turning their kitchens into escape routes. They built hidden trap doors into the floors, usually concealed beneath removable floorboards or hidden under heavy tables that could be moved quickly by someone who knew the secret. These doors opened into tunnels that connected to other buildings on the property, to natural caves, or sometimes to the homesteads of trusted neighbors. The Wilson family, who settled near Dallas in 1872, created what was probably the most elaborate escape system in North Texas. James Wilson had been a mining engineer before trying his luck at farming, and he brought a professional understanding of excavation and tunnel construction to his home defense planning. The Wilson kitchen looked ordinary enough. A large room with a stone fireplace, a heavy oak table where the family took their meals, and shelves lined with the usual frontier necessities. But beneath that oak table, hidden under a removable section of the wooden floor, was the entrance to an underground network that would have impressed a military engineer. The main tunnel was tall enough for an adult to crawl through comfortably, about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide. The walls were lined with carefully fitted stones to prevent cave-ins, and the floor was covered with wooden planks to make movement quick and quiet. Most importantly, the tunnel was ventilated through a series of hidden air shafts that emerged at ground level, disguised as natural features or concealed within other farm structures. But this wasn't just a single escape route. It was an entire underground transportation system. The main tunnel branched into three separate passages, each leading to a different exit point. The first tunnel led to the Wilsons' barn, emerging through a trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of hay. This exit allowed the family to escape while remaining close to their horses, essential if they needed to flee the area entirely. The second tunnel led to their root cellar, which James had expanded into a combination storage facility and defensive positions similar to the Henderson family's panic room. This route allowed the family to disappear from the house and reappear in a fortified position from which they could observe and, if necessary, defend their property. The third tunnel was the most ambitious. It led nearly 200 yards from the house to a natural depression in the prairie, hidden among a grove of oak trees. This exit was completely invisible from the house and the surrounding area, allowing family members to escape undetected, even if the property was completely surrounded by enemies. But James Wilson's engineering background led him to include features that went beyond simple escape routes. The tunnel system included hidden storage chambers where the family could cache weapons, ammunition, food, and other supplies. These chambers were accessed through concealed panels in the tunnel walls, and each one was stocked with enough materials to support the family for several days, if they had to remain hidden underground. Even more ingeniously, the tunnels could be used for offensive operations as well as defensive ones. James had incorporated what he called sally ports, concealed entrances that could be opened from inside the tunnel system, allowing defenders to emerge behind attackers who thought they had the house surrounded. It was medieval siege warfare adapted for the Texas frontier. The sensory experience of moving through these tunnels was unlike anything most people had ever encountered. The temperature underground remained constant year-round, cool in the brutal Texas summers, warm during the occasional harsh winters. The air smelled of earth and timber, with undertones of the gun oil that James used to maintain the weapons cached throughout the system. There was always the faint sound of your own breathing, amplified in the confined space, and the soft scraping of cloth against stone as you crawled through passages barely tall enough for an adult. But most unsettling was the darkness. Even with oil lamps positioned at regular intervals, the tunnels were filled with shadows that seemed to move and shift as you passed. Children who grew up using these passages developed an almost supernatural ability to navigate in near total darkness, moving by touch and memory through spaces that would terrify most adults. The Wilson family's tunnel system was put to the test in the summer of 1873, during what became known locally as the Phantom Ranch War. A dispute over water rights had escalated into open violence between homesteaders and a group of cattle barons who claimed that small farmers were interfering with their grazing operations. The conflict had already resulted in several deaths, and word was spreading that hired gunmen were targeting isolated farm families who refused to abandon their claims. The Wilson family received their warning from a neighbor, Mary Patterson, who arrived at their homestead just after sunset on a hot July evening. She'd ridden hard from her own place, 5 miles to the east, where she'd seen something that chilled her to the bone. 6 armed men making camp in the hills overlooking the Wilson property, clearly planning some kind of nighttime operation. James Wilson didn't hesitate. He'd spent months preparing for exactly this situation, and he knew that their survival depended on executing their escape plan perfectly. Within minutes, the entire family had vanished through the kitchen trapdoor and into the underground network that James had spent 2 years constructing. But instead of simply hiding, James implemented the offensive component of his plan. While his wife Elizabeth and their 3 children made their way to the concealed exit near the oak grove, James used the tunnel system to position himself in the barn, where he could observe the approaches to their house while remaining completely hidden. What he saw confirmed Mary Patterson's warning and more. The men making their way toward the Wilson homestead weren't just cattle company enforcers. They were professional killers, moving with the precision of a military unit. They had clearly scouted the property in advance because they approached from 3 different directions simultaneously, cutting off what they thought were all possible escape routes. The leader of the group was a man James recognized from descriptions he'd heard. Cole Hartley, a former Confederate officer who'd turned to gun work after the war. Hartley had a reputation for efficiency and brutality, and the men with him were known quantities as well. Experienced killers who took pride in leaving no witnesses behind. From his hidden position in the barn, James watched the gunmen surround his house and begin their assault. They weren't interested in robbery. This was pure elimination. They poured rifle fire through the windows, kicked down the door, and stormed inside, clearly expecting to find a family cowering in terror. Instead, they found an empty house. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. These men were accustomed to overwhelming their targets with superior firepower and numbers. They weren't prepared for their victims to simply disappear. James could hear them shouting to each other, their voices carrying clearly across the night air as they searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. "Where the hell did they go?" one of them shouted. "Check the cellar," Hartley ordered. "Check the barn. They can't have gone far." But that's when James sprung the second part of his trap. While the gunmen were searching the empty house, Elizabeth had used the Oak Grove tunnel to circle around behind them. She emerged from a concealed position nearly a quarter-mile from the house, where James had cached a loaded rifle and a supply of ammunition. The first shot came from an impossible angle, behind and to the left of the house, from a position the gunman hadn't even considered. Elizabeth's bullet took one of Hartley's men in the back, dropping him instantly. The shot was so unexpected, so completely without warning, that the remaining gunmen thought they were under attack from an entire posse. The second shot came from the barn, where James had positioned himself with a clear field of fire across the yard. His target was Cole Hartley himself, and the bullet caught the outlaw leader in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into the darkness. Now the Wilson family had turned the tables completely. The professional killers found themselves caught in a crossfire from invisible enemies, taking accurate rifle fire from positions they hadn't anticipated. What had been planned as a simple massacre had turned into a complex ambush with the intended victims now controlling the battlefield. The psychological impact was devastating. These men were accustomed to being the hunters, not the hunted. They were used to overwhelming force and clear targets, not phantom enemies who could appear and disappear at will. Within minutes, their disciplined assault had dissolved into panicked confusion. James and Elizabeth continued their coordinated attack, using the tunnel system to change positions and maintain the illusion that they were facing a much larger force. James would fire from the barn, then disappear back into the tunnels and emerge from the root cellar for his next shot. Elizabeth used the Oak Grove tunnel to move between multiple firing positions, creating the impression of at least 4 or 5 different shooters. The surviving members of Hartley's gang broke and ran after losing 3 of their number to enemies they never saw clearly. Cole Hartley himself, wounded and demoralized, managed to make it to his horse and escape, but his reputation as an unstoppable killer was permanently damaged. Word spread quickly through the outlaw community that the Wilson place was protected by ghosts who could shoot back. But James Wilson understood that his family's victory would only make them more of a target in the long run. Professional killers don't like to be embarrassed, and Cole Hartley was the type of man who would return with more men and better planning. The tunnel system had saved their lives once, but it wouldn't remain a secret forever. That's when James made the decision to expand his defensive preparations even further. If his family was going to survive on the frontier, they needed more than just escape routes. They needed to turn their entire homestead into a fortress that could fight back. The concept of escape beds took the tunnel idea to its logical conclusion. Instead of limiting escape routes to common areas like kitchens, some frontier families built their sleeping areas directly over hidden passages. A person could literally roll out of bed and disappear through the floor, emerging hundreds of yards away while attackers were still searching the bedroom. The construction required careful planning and skilled carpentry. The bed frame had to be built as part of a platform system that could be quickly moved or folded back to reveal a trap door underneath. The passage below had to be wide enough for rapid transit, but small enough to remain structurally sound. And the exit point had to be carefully concealed and strategically positioned. Martha Collins, a widow who homesteaded alone near San Antonio, created perhaps the most ingenious escape bed system on the frontier. Her bedroom appeared normal in every way. A simple rope frame bed, a washstand, a trunk for her clothes. But the bed was actually mounted on a platform with a hidden hinge system that allowed the entire sleeping area to fold back like the lid of a chest. Beneath the bed was a passage that led directly to a natural cave system about 300 yards from her house. The cave had been modified to serve as both an escape route and a long-term hiding place, with storage for food, water, weapons, and other necessities. Most importantly, the cave had multiple exits, making it nearly impossible for attackers to trap her underground. Martha's system proved its worth in the winter of 1875, when a group of Confederate deserters who had turned to banditry decided that a woman living alone would make an easy target. They were wrong. Martha heard them approaching in the pre-dawn darkness and immediately implemented her escape plan. Within seconds, she had rolled out of bed, triggered the hidden mechanism that folded back her sleeping platform, and dropped into the passage that led to the cave system. By the time the deserters kicked in her front door, she had already traveled nearly half the distance to her underground refuge. From the cave, Martha could observe the entire area around her homestead through carefully concealed observation points. She watched the deserters search her house, growing increasingly frustrated as they realized their intended victim had vanished completely. But Martha's preparations went beyond simple escape. She had turned the cave system into a base of operations from which she could strike back. Using passages that emerged at different points around her property, Martha began a campaign of psychological warfare against the deserters. She would appear at one location, fire a shot, then disappear before they could respond. Minutes later, she would emerge from a completely different position and fire again. From the deserters' perspective, they were facing multiple enemies who could appear and disappear at will. The campaign lasted 3 days. Martha used her underground network to remain invisible while slowly picking off the men who had come to kill her. She didn't shoot to kill. She shot to wound and terrorize, creating a growing sense of supernatural dread among the survivors. By the end of the 3rd day, the remaining deserters were convinced that Martha Collins was either a witch or a ghost, and they fled the area, spreading stories that kept other potential attackers away for years. Collapsible staircases. In the few 2-story frontier homes that existed, usually belonging to more prosperous families who had established successful ranches or businesses, the staircase itself became a crucial element of the home's defensive system. These weren't the permanent, architecturally integrated staircases of Eastern homes. They were designed as removable barriers that could be eliminated in seconds, turning the upper floor into an impregnable fortress. The engineering was both simple and brilliant. Instead of being permanently attached to the house structure with nails and brackets, the staircase was held in place by a system of removable pins and supports. Pull the pins, kick out the supports, and the entire stairway would collapse or could be hauled up to the 2nd floor, leaving attackers with no way to reach the family members above. But frontier ingenuity didn't stop with simple removal. Many of these staircases were built with additional defensive features that turned them into weapons in their own right. Each step might conceal a hidden compartment containing ammunition, spare weapons, or other supplies. When the staircase was collapsed, these supplies would spill out onto the ground floor, providing defenders upstairs with the tools they needed for an extended siege. The Henderson family near Dallas, different from the Abilene Hendersons we met earlier, took this concept to its absolute limit. Their two-story farmhouse was one of the finest in the region, a testament to the success of Robert Henderson's cattle operation. But Robert understood that prosperity made his family a target, and he had incorporated defensive features that would have impressed a medieval castle designer. Their staircase was a masterpiece of disguised functionality. To visitors, it appeared to be a solid, well-built set of steps leading to the bedrooms upstairs. The wood was carefully finished, the banister was elegantly carved, and everything appeared permanently installed. But appearances were deceiving. The entire structure was designed as a modular system. The support beams were held in place by pins that could be removed in seconds by someone who knew where they were located. The steps themselves were connected with a system of hooks and brackets that would separate cleanly when the supports were removed. Most ingeniously, the collapsed staircase could be reassembled from above using a pulley system that Robert had installed in the ceiling. This meant that the family could eliminate access to the second floor when under attack, but they could also create a bridge to the upstairs windows for escape if the situation became desperate. It was medieval siege. Engineering adapted for the American frontier, complete with the ability to raise and lower the drawbridge as tactical situations changed. But Robert Henderson's staircase had one more feature that pushed it into the realm of active weaponry. Each step was hollow and contained a spring-loaded mechanism that could launch objects with considerable force. In peacetime, these mechanisms were disabled, and the steps functioned normally. But when activated, the staircase became a kind of medieval trebuchet, capable of launching anything from rocks to knives to small explosive charges. The system was tested in the autumn of 1878, when a gang of cattle rustlers decided that the Henderson herd would be easier to steal if the Henderson family was eliminated first. They approached the house just before dawn, intending to overwhelm the family with superior numbers and firepower. Robert Henderson had been expecting this kind of attack for months. His cattle operation had been successful enough to attract attention, and he'd heard rumors that professional thieves were operating in the area. When his youngest son spotted the rustlers approaching, the family implemented their defensive plan with military precision. Within 2 minutes, the entire Henderson family had retreated to the second floor and collapsed the staircase behind them. The rustlers found themselves in possession of the ground floor of the house, but with no way to reach the family members above them. What had seemed like a straightforward assault had suddenly become a complex siege. But Robert Henderson wasn't content to simply wait out the attackers. As the rustlers spread out through the ground floor, trying to figure out how to reach their intended victims, Robert activated the staircase's offensive capabilities. The first volley launched a collection of rocks and metal scraps from the collapsed steps, creating a devastating shotgun effect that caught 3 of the rustlers completely by surprise. The second volley included several small charges of black powder that exploded on impact, filling the ground floor with smoke and confusion. From the rustlers' perspective, they were under attack from weapons they couldn't understand or counter. The house itself seemed to be fighting back, launching projectiles from impossible angles. The psychological impact was devastating. These men were accustomed to overwhelming their targets with superior firepower, not to being trapped inside structures that could shoot back at them. The siege lasted until the following evening, with the Henderson family maintaining their position upstairs while the rustlers tried unsuccessfully to find a way to reach them. Every attempt to construct makeshift ladders or to climb the exterior walls was met with accurate rifle fire from the second-floor windows. Meanwhile, the family used their pulley system to resupply themselves with food and ammunition from caches they had prepared throughout the house. Finally, as night fell on the second day, the surviving rustlers decided that the Henderson cattle weren't worth the cost they were paying. They fled into the darkness, leaving behind 3 dead companions and a story that would be retold in outlaw camps for years to come. Robert Henderson's defensive system had worked perfectly, but he understood that his family's reputation as a hard target would only make them more attractive to certain types of criminals, those who saw the challenge as worth the risk. He spent the following winter expanding his defenses even further, turning his prosperous ranch house into something that resembled a military fortification more than a family home. The psychological impact of these collapsible staircases went far beyond their practical defensive value. They represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between frontier families and their homes. Instead of being passive victims waiting for protection from distant law enforcement, these families had turned their dwellings into active participants in their own defense. Children who grew up in houses with collapsible staircases developed a unique understanding of architecture and engineering. They learned to see their homes not as static structures, but as complex machines designed to protect and serve their occupants. They understood that every beam, every board, every seemingly decorative element might have a hidden purpose. This knowledge shaped their worldview in profound ways. They grew up understanding that survival often depended on preparation, that apparent weakness could conceal hidden strength, and that the difference between life and death might come down to the mechanical advantage provided by a carefully designed lever or pulley. But perhaps most importantly, these defensive systems taught frontier families that they had more options than simply fighting or fleeing. Sometimes the smartest strategy was to control the battlefield itself, to use the environment as a weapon and to turn the enemy's assumptions against them. The collapsed staircase was more than just a defensive measure. It was a psychological weapon that transformed confident attackers into confused and demoralized victims. It represented the frontier spirit at its most ingenious, the refusal to accept defeat, the determination to turn every disadvantage into an advantage, and the absolute commitment to protecting family and property, regardless of the odds. These strange and forgotten features of frontier homes tell a story that goes far deeper than simple mechanical innovation. They reveal the mindset of people living on the absolute edge of civilization, where survival depended not just on courage and skill, but on the ability to think several steps ahead of those who meant them harm. Every hidden panel, every concealed weapon, every secret passage represented hours of planning and preparation by families who understood that their lives hung in the balance. They couldn't depend on law enforcement that might be hundreds of miles away. They couldn't rely on neighbors who faced their own struggles for survival. They had only themselves, their ingenuity, and their determination to protect what they had built. The homes they created were more than shelters. They were fortresses, weapons, and sanctuaries all rolled into one. They were the physical manifestation of the frontier spirit, adaptable, resourceful, and absolutely refusing to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. Part 2. Weaponized everyday life. Living on the Texas frontier meant that the line between everyday objects and instruments of war was often invisible. A butter churn might conceal a rifle. A rocking chair could launch deadly projectiles. Even the most mundane household items, things so ordinary that no attacker would give them a second glance, could become weapons capable of turning the tide in a life or death struggle. This wasn't paranoia. It was practicality born from harsh experience. Frontier families learned quickly that survival often depended on their ability to appear harmless while remaining deadly, to seem vulnerable while actually controlling every aspect of their environment. They turned their homes into elaborate stage sets where nothing was quite what it appeared to be. Outhouse arsenals. Let's start with perhaps the most unlikely defensive position on any frontier property, the outhouse. That humble wooden structure standing alone at a respectful distance from the main house seemed like the last place anyone would look for trouble, which of course made it perfect for storing trouble. Charlie Morrison was a cattle rancher who settled near Dodge City in 1876, and he understood better than most that outlaws and rustlers looked for patterns of weakness they could exploit. They expected frontier families to be most vulnerable when they were separated from their weapons, when they were caught in compromising positions, when they were literally caught with their pants down. Charlie's outhouse looked like every other privy on the frontier, a simple wooden structure with a crescent moon cut into the door, built over a deep pit and positioned downwind from the main house. But appearances were deceiving. Charlie had turned his necessity house into what he liked to call his last resort arsenal. The modifications were subtle but deadly effective. Those walls weren't just for privacy. They were gun ports. What looked like simple ventilation holes were actually firing positions, carefully sized and positioned to allow someone inside to cover the entire approach to the main house with accurate rifle fire. The angles had been calculated with military precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that would make it nearly impossible for attackers to advance without being seen and shot. But the real genius was in the concealment. Charlie had hollowed out the space beneath the outhouse seat and lined it with oiled canvas to create a waterproof weapons cache. Inside this hidden armory, he kept a Winchester rifle, 2 Colt revolvers, 50 rounds of ammunition, and even a sawed-off shotgun for close-quarters work. The weapons were wrapped in oiled cloth and stored in wooden boxes that protected them from moisture while keeping them instantly accessible. The psychological impact of this arrangement was devastating. Outlaws might surround the main house, thinking they had the family trapped, only to discover that deadly accurate gunfire was coming from the toilet. It was humiliating, confusing, and tactically brilliant all at once. Charlie's system saved his life in the spring of 1877, when a gang of horse thieves decided that his small spread would make an easy target. They'd been watching the place for days, noting the family's routines and identifying what they thought were vulnerabilities in the property's defenses. The attack came at dawn when Charlie was making his regular morning trip to the outhouse. From the outlaws' perspective, this was perfect timing. Their target was isolated, unarmed, and in no position to mount effective resistance. They planned to capture Charlie quickly and quietly, then use him as leverage to convince his family to surrender their horses and whatever valuables they might have hidden. But Charlie Morrison had been expecting this kind of attack for months. The moment he heard horses approaching at an unusual hour, he knew what was happening. Instead of panicking, he calmly reached under the outhouse seat and armed himself with enough firepower to hold off a small army. The first shot came as a complete surprise to the horse thieves. They were approaching what they thought was a helpless victim when gunfire erupted from the outhouse itself. Charlie's Winchester rifle spoke with deadly accuracy, and the leader of the gang toppled from his saddle with a bullet through his chest. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. From the outlaws' perspective, they were under attack from the toilet. It was so unexpected, so completely outside their understanding of how frontier conflicts worked, that they initially thought they were being pranked. But as Charlie continued to fire from his wooden fortress, picking off their horses and forcing them to take cover behind whatever they could find, they realized that their easy target had turned into a nightmare. Charlie's position in the outhouse gave him several tactical advantages that the outlaws hadn't anticipated. The wooden walls, provided excellent cover from return fire, while the carefully positioned gun ports allowed him to see and shoot in multiple directions. Most importantly, the outlaws had no way to approach his position without exposing themselves to his fire. The siege lasted most of the morning, with Charlie systematically destroying the outlaws' ability to fight back. He shot their horses to prevent escape, then began working on the outlaws themselves, wounding rather than killing them to create maximum psychological impact. The men who'd been shot began crying and begging for mercy, which demoralized the survivors even further. By noon, the surviving members of the gang were ready to surrender, but Charlie Morrison wasn't finished with them yet. Using a technique that would have impressed a military strategist, he began moving between different defensive positions, using hidden passages and concealed weapons caches to create the illusion that he was a much larger force. The outlaws never realized that their humiliating defeat had been engineered by a single man armed with weapons he kept in his toilet. They fled the area convinced that the Morrison Ranch was defended by at least a dozen hidden gunmen, and word spread through the outlaw community that Charlie Morrison's place was not a safe target. But Charlie understood that his outhouse arsenal was just one component of a comprehensive defensive system. He spent the following months expanding his concept of weaponized everyday objects throughout his entire property, turning his ranch into a place where literally anything might be a weapon in disguise. Suicide porches. The front porch was the face that frontier homes presented to the world, a symbol of hospitality, a place where visitors could rest and neighbors could gather for conversation. It represented civilization, community, and welcome, which made it perfect for concealing one of the most deadly traps in the frontier defensive arsenal. A suicide porch looked exactly like any other front porch, complete with wooden planking, support posts, and often a rocking chair or two where the family could sit in the evening and watch the sunset. But underneath that facade of domestic tranquility was a killing machine designed to eliminate unwanted visitors in the most dramatic way possible. The engineering was brilliantly simple. The porch appeared to be supported by solid wooden posts, but these supports were actually held in place by removable pins that could be pulled from inside the house. The flooring looked permanent, but was actually loose planking that would collapse the moment the supports were removed. Beneath the porch was a pit, carefully excavated and often filled with sharpened stakes, broken glass, or other materials designed to injure or kill anyone who fell into it. The Johnson family, who homesteaded near Tombstone in 1879, took this concept to its absolute extreme. Their front porch was more than just a collapsing trap. It was a military-grade explosive device disguised as a piece of domestic architecture. Samuel Johnson had served as a demolitions expert in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he brought his professional knowledge of explosives to his family's home defense planning. The Johnson porch looked completely normal from the outside, but hidden beneath the floorboards was enough dynamite to level half the house. The system was designed with multiple triggers. The primary mechanism was activated from inside the house. Samuel could pull a hidden wire that would set off the entire charge. But there was also a pressure trigger that would activate if too many people stood on the porch simultaneously. And finally, there was a timer system that Samuel could set if he knew trouble was coming, giving his family time to evacuate before the explosion. But the psychological impact of the Johnson porch went beyond its destructive capability. Samuel had spread word through the local community about his special welcome for unwanted visitors, creating a reputation that deterred most potential attackers before they even approached his property. The few who were brave enough or foolish enough to test his defenses quickly learned that Samuel Johnson was not a man to be trifled with. And the porch was tested in the winter of 1880, when a group of claim jumpers decided that the Johnson property would make a valuable addition to their holdings. These weren't common outlaws. They were businessmen backed by Eastern capital, using hired gunmen to force small homesteaders off valuable land that could then be acquired through legal manipulation. The gunmen who approached the Johnson homestead that December morning were professionals, experienced in the intimidation tactics that had worked on other frontier families. They rode up to the house in formation, clearly intending to make a show of force that would convince the Johnson family to abandon their claim without a fight. But Samuel Johnson had been expecting this visit for weeks. He'd received warnings from other homesteaders who'd been pressured by the same group, and he'd spent the time preparing not just his explosive porch, but a comprehensive defensive plan that would teach these hired killers that some frontier families couldn't be intimidated. The gunmen dismounted and approached the front porch with the arrogant confidence of men who'd never been effectively challenged. Their leader, a man named Crawford, who had a reputation for getting results through a combination of legal threats and physical violence, walked up the porch steps and knocked on the front door with the attitude of someone who expected immediate compliance with his demands. Samuel Johnson answered the door with a smile, engaging Crawford in what appeared to be a normal conversation about the weather and local conditions. But while they talked, Samuel was counting heads, noting the positions of Crawford's men and calculating the timing for what he knew would happen next. Crawford began his intimidation routine, explaining in legal terminology why the Johnson family's claim was invalid and describing the unfortunate things that might happen to families who refused to cooperate with legitimate business interests. He was in the middle of his speech when Samuel casually mentioned that Crawford and his men might want to step off the porch. Crawford, thinking this was the beginning of the Johnson family's surrender, gestured for his men to join him on the porch. That was exactly what Samuel had been waiting for. When all 6 gunmen were standing on the wooden planking, Samuel pulled the hidden wire that activated the explosive system he'd installed beneath their feet. The explosion was devastating. The porch didn't just collapse, it disintegrated, along with everyone standing on it. The psychological impact on any surviving witnesses was immediate and permanent. Word spread quickly through the community that Samuel Johnson had literally blown up his own front porch, taking a gang of hired killers with it. But Samuel had calculated the explosion carefully. The charge was positioned so that it would destroy the porch and anyone standing on it, while leaving the main house intact. Within hours of the explosion, Samuel and his family were cleaning up the debris and planning to build a new porch, one that would incorporate even more sophisticated defensive features. The Johnson family's explosive welcome became legendary throughout the Arizona territory. Other families began incorporating similar systems into their own homes, though few had Samuel's professional expertise with explosives. The concept of the suicide porch spread throughout the frontier, creating a new category of home defense that turned hospitality itself into a weapon. Window-weight weapons. Every frontier home with sash windows, which were more common than most people realize, had a built-in weapon system that most families never thought to utilize. The counterweight system that allowed heavy windows to be raised and lowered with relative ease could be modified to create weapons that were both effective and completely invisible to casual observation. The basic principle was simple. Sash windows used iron weights, usually weighing 15 to 20 pounds each, connected to the window frame by ropes that ran over pulleys. These weights were hidden inside the window frame, invisible from both inside and outside the house. But with minor modifications, they could be turned into devastating weapons. Thomas Morrison, a homesteader near Kansas City, was probably the first to fully exploit the offensive potential of his window hardware. Thomas had been a blacksmith before trying his luck at farming, and he understood both metallurgy and mechanical systems well enough to see possibilities that others missed. Thomas's modifications were subtle, but deadly effective. Instead of standard iron window weights, he cast his own, using lead and steel, creating weights that were both heavier and more deadly than the original hardware. More importantly, he shaped them with sharp edges and points that would turn them into effective clubs or spears when deployed. But the real genius was in the deployment system. Thomas had modified his window pulleys so that the weights could be released instantly by pulling a hidden lever. The weights would then fall with tremendous force, guided by slots he'd cut into the window frame to ensure accuracy. An attacker trying to climb through a window would suddenly find 20 pounds of sharpened metal dropping onto his head at near terminal velocity. Even more ingeniously, Thomas had attached chains to some of his weights, turning them into medieval-style flails that could be swung with deadly effect. Pull the right lever, and the window weight would drop to the end of its chain, where it could be swung like a massive club at anyone within range. Thomas's window weight weapons were tested during a home invasion in the summer of 1875, when 3 outlaws decided that a farmer living alone would make an easy target. They approached the Morrison homestead just after midnight, planning to break in through the windows and overwhelm their victim before he could mount effective resistance. The first outlaw to try climbing through a window triggered Thomas's defensive system by accident. The man was halfway through the window opening when the modified weight mechanism activated, dropping 25 pounds of sharpened steel directly onto his skull. He was killed instantly, his body jamming the window opening and alerting Thomas to the fact that he was under attack. The second attacker tried a different window, only to discover that Thomas had rigged multiple windows with the same deadly system. This weight was attached to a chain, and Thomas was able to swing it like a wrecking ball, catching the outlaw in the chest and sending him flying backwards off the porch. The third outlaw, seeing his companions killed or disabled by apparently supernatural forces, decided that discretion was the better part of valor and fled into the night. But Thomas Morrison wasn't content to simply let him escape. Using his window weight weapons in offensive mode, he began systematically destroying the outlaws' horses and equipment, making it impossible for them to threaten other frontier families. The psychological impact of Thomas's weapon system went far beyond its immediate tactical effectiveness. Word spread through the outlaw community that the Morrison place was protected by windows that could kill, creating a supernatural aura that kept potential attackers away for years. But Thomas understood that his window weight weapons were just one component of a comprehensive defensive strategy. He spent the following months expanding his concept of weaponized household objects throughout his property, turning his modest farm into a fortress that could fight back against any threat. Chamber pot bombs. Of all the weaponized household objects that frontier families created, perhaps none was more psychologically devastating than the chamber pot bomb. It combined the practical necessity of indoor sanitation with the destructive power of military-grade explosives, creating a weapon that was both effective and profoundly demoralizing to its victims. The basic construction was surprisingly simple. A standard ceramic chamber pot, the kind found in every frontier bedroom, would be fitted with a charge of black powder and various pieces of shrapnel. Nails, broken glass, metal scraps, anything that could cause injury when propelled by an explosive charge. A simple fuse system allowed the device to be thrown like a grenade, with a timer that gave the user enough opportunity to take cover before detonation. But the real psychological impact came from the nature of the container itself. These were chamber pots, devices associated with the most private and vulnerable aspects of human existence. To be attacked with such a weapon was profoundly humiliating, suggesting that the defender considered the attackers to be literally lower than human waste. Rebecca Martinez, a widow who ran a small trading post near the Mexican border, became legendary for her use of chamber pot bombs during a siege that lasted 3 days and nights. Rebecca's trading post served both Mexican and American customers, making it a valuable target for bandits who operated on both sides of the border. The attack came in the spring of 1878, when a mixed gang of Mexican bandidos and American outlaws decided that Rebecca's isolated trading post would be easy prey. They surrounded the building just after dawn, expecting to overwhelm a single woman through sheer numbers and intimidation. Rebecca Martinez had other ideas. She'd been preparing for this kind of attack for months, stockpiling not just conventional weapons and ammunition, but a collection of improvised explosive devices that would have impressed a military engineer. Her chamber pot bombs were just one component of a defensive arsenal that turned her trading post into a fortress capable of withstanding a prolonged siege. The first chamber pot bomb detonated when the outlaws tried to break down her front door. The explosion was devastating, not just because of the physical damage it caused, but because of the psychological impact on the attackers. They were being assaulted with toilet equipment, turning their attempted robbery into something that felt more like a comedy than a serious, criminal enterprise. But Rebecca wasn't finished. Over the course of the 3-day siege, she deployed more than a dozen chamber pot bombs, using them to break up coordinated attacks and to demoralize the outlaws, who thought they had her trapped. Each explosion was accompanied by taunts and insults that made it clear that Rebecca considered her attackers to be something less than human. The siege ended when the surviving outlaws, thoroughly humiliated and demoralized, decided that Rebecca Martinez's trading post was not worth the cost they were paying. They retreated across the border, spreading stories about the crazy woman who fought with toilet bombs, creating a reputation that protected Rebecca's business for years to come. Kitchen knife launchers. The frontier kitchen was already a dangerous place, filled with sharp objects, hot surfaces, and open flames. But some frontier families took the concept of kitchen danger to a whole new level, turning their cooking areas into weapons factories that could launch deadly projectiles with mechanical precision. The basic principle was to modify the standard kitchen knife rack, a common feature in every frontier home, to serve as a launching system. The knives would be held in spring-loaded mechanisms that could fire them across the room with deadly accuracy. A hidden trigger could launch the entire contents of the rack in a matter of seconds, turning the kitchen into something resembling a medieval siege engine. Margaret Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who settled near San Antonio, created what was probably the most sophisticated kitchen weapon system on the frontier. Margaret had grown up listening to her grandfather's stories about Irish resistance to British occupation, and she understood that the most effective weapons were often those that appeared completely innocent until they were deployed. Margaret's kitchen looked like any other frontier cooking area. A stone fireplace, wooden counters, shelves lined with pots and pans, and a knife rack holding the usual collection of cooking implements. But appearances were deceiving. Every knife in Margaret's collection had been specially modified for throwing, balanced, and sharpened to perfection. More importantly, the rack itself was a spring-powered launching system that could fire the knives with enough force to penetrate wooden walls at 30 feet. The system was tested during a home invasion in the winter of 1876, when 4 outlaws broke into Margaret's kitchen, expecting to find a helpless woman who would provide them with information about local bank shipments. Instead, they found themselves facing a weapon system that turned cooking utensils into guided missiles. Margaret's first volley launched 6 throwing knives simultaneously, each one aimed at a different target. The knives struck with enough force to pin one outlaw to the wooden wall behind him, while the others dove for cover, trying to understand what kind of weaponry they were facing. But Margaret had prepared for extended combat. Hidden throughout her kitchen were additional knife collections, each one designed for different tactical situations. She had throwing knives for long-range work, fighting knives for close combat, and even specialized tools that could serve as both cooking implements and weapons. The psychological impact on the outlaws was immediate and devastating. They'd come to rob a kitchen and found themselves trapped in what appeared to be a medieval armory. Margaret's taunts, delivered in a thick Irish accent, made it clear that she considered them to be inferior opponents who didn't deserve the mercy of a quick death. The battle lasted until dawn, with Margaret using her intimate knowledge of the kitchen's layout to outmaneuver and outfight opponents who had expected to overwhelm her through superior numbers. By sunrise, 3 of the 4 outlaws were dead, and the survivor was begging for mercy while bleeding from multiple knife wounds. Weaponized wells. The well was the most vital feature of any frontier homestead. The source of life in a harsh environment where water meant the difference between survival and death. But some frontier families turned their wells into defensive weapons that were as deadly as they were essential. The concept was to modify the well structure to serve as both a water source and a trap for unwanted visitors. This could involve creating false bottoms that would collapse under the weight of intruders, installing hidden chambers that could serve as ambush positions, or even rigging the entire well with explosive charges that could be detonated if enemies tried to poison the water supply. Jacob Patterson, who homesteaded in the Arizona desert, created perhaps the most elaborate, weaponized well system on the frontier. The desert environment made water critically important, but it also made Patterson's well a natural target for raiders who wanted to control or destroy his family's water supply. Patterson's well appeared normal from the surface, a stone-lined shaft with a wooden cover and a rope and bucket system for drawing water. But beneath the surface was a complex defensive system that turned the well into a fortress capable of protecting both the water supply and the family that depended on it. The well had multiple levels, with the actual water source at the bottom and hidden chambers at various depths that could serve as storage areas or defensive positions. Access to these chambers was through concealed handholds in the stone walls, invisible to casual observation but allowing defenders to climb up and down the well shaft while remaining completely hidden. But the real genius was in the false bottom system. What appeared to be solid ground around the well was actually a carefully camouflaged trap that would collapse under the weight of multiple intruders, dropping them into a pit filled with sharpened stakes. The mechanism was so well designed that it could distinguish between the weight of a single person drawing water and the heavier load of multiple attackers approaching the well. Patterson's system was tested during a drought in the summer of 1879, when a gang of water pirates decided that his well would solve their supply problems. These weren't ordinary outlaws. They were specialists who targeted isolated water sources, either stealing the water or demanding payment from anyone who wanted to use it. The water pirates approached Patterson's well at night, expecting to find an undefended water source that they could easily capture and control. Instead, they triggered the false bottom system, which dropped 4 of them into the spike-filled pit, while Patterson and his family watched from hidden positions within the well structure itself. The psychological impact was devastating. The surviving water pirates found themselves under attack from the well itself, with gunfire coming from impossible angles, and their companions dying in what appeared to be a supernatural trap. They fled the area, spreading stories about the haunted well that fought back against those who tried to steal its water. The psychology of weaponized living. Living with these weaponized household objects required a complete transformation of how frontier families thought about their homes and their possessions. Nothing could be taken at face value. Every object had to be evaluated for its potential as both a tool and a weapon. Even the most mundane daily activities, cooking, cleaning, sleeping, became tactical exercises that required constant awareness of defensive possibilities. Children who grew up in these environments developed skills that would have impressed military strategists. They learned to move through their homes with an awareness of sightlines and fields of fire. They understood which objects could be used as weapons and how to access hidden armaments quickly and quietly. They practiced routines that would allow them to transform their domestic environment into a battlefield within seconds. But perhaps most importantly, they developed a mindset that refused to accept helplessness as an option. These families understood that survival often depended not on superior firepower or numbers, but on the ability to use intelligence, preparation, and environmental advantages to turn apparent weaknesses into strengths. The weaponized household objects they created were more than just tactical innovations. They were expressions of a philosophy that viewed every challenge as a problem to be solved through ingenuity and determination. They represented the frontier spirit at its most creative and resourceful, turning the necessities of daily life into the tools of survival. These strange and forgotten weapons tell us something important about the people who created them. They were not passive victims, waiting for protection from distant authorities. They were active participants in their own defense, willing to transform their entire way of life in order to protect what they had built. Their legacy lives on in the American character, in the belief that ordinary people can overcome extraordinary challenges through intelligence, preparation, and the refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The chamber pot bombs and knife launchers may be gone, but the spirit that created them remains a fundamental part of what it means to be American. Part 3. Frontier. Ingenuity in diplomacy and survival. The Texas frontier wasn't just about violence and defense, though there was plenty of both. It was also about the delicate art of survival through diplomacy, communication, and the kind of ingenious problem-solving that turned isolation into advantage. The families who thrived out here understood that sometimes the best weapon was a well-timed conversation, and that survival often depended more on what you knew than what you could shoot. But even diplomacy on the frontier had teeth. Every peaceful interaction was backed by the implicit threat of violence. Every trade negotiation took place within sight of hidden weapons, and every act of hospitality was carefully calculated to maintain the delicate balance between cooperation and self-preservation. Indian trading windows. The relationship between Texas settlers and Native Americans was far more complex than Hollywood has ever shown us. Yes, there was violence, brutal, devastating conflicts that left scars on both communities for generations. But there was also trade, communication, and a grudging mutual respect, born from the recognition that both groups were trying to survive in the same harsh environment. The Indian trading window was perhaps the most ingenious solution to the problem of how to conduct business with people who might, depending on circumstances, be either valuable trading partners or deadly enemies. These weren't just windows. They were carefully engineered communication systems that allowed for commerce while maintaining defensive advantages for both sides. Martha Stevenson's homestead near San Antonio featured what was probably the most sophisticated trading window system in Texas. Martha had arrived from Pennsylvania in 1879 with her husband David, full of Eastern ideas about how to deal with hostile savages. But the harsh realities of frontier life quickly taught her that survival often meant putting aside prejudices and learning to see the world through different eyes. The Stevenson trading window looked, from the outside, like a perfectly normal cabin window, perhaps a bit smaller than usual, with wooden shutters that could be closed against bad weather. But look closer, and you'd notice the unusual thickness of the window frame, the iron bars that were decorative on the outside but functional on the inside, and the small wooden shelf built into the sill at exactly the right height for passing objects back and forth. Inside the cabin, The window revealed its true complexity. The opening was designed so that only one person could approach at a time from either side, and the angle made it impossible to shoot directly through from outside. More importantly, the window included a system of mirrors that allowed Martha to observe the entire area around her homestead while appearing to focus only on whoever was at the trading post. But the real genius was in the communication system Martha developed. She spent months learning enough Apache and Comanche words to conduct basic negotiations, but more importantly, she created a visual language using colored cloth strips and wooden symbols that could convey complex information about available goods, desired trades, and even warnings about mutual threats like outlaw gangs or military patrols. The psychological impact of the trading window went far beyond its practical function. It represented a recognition that the people on both sides of the cultural divide were intelligent human beings capable of rational negotiation. It suggested that conflict wasn't inevitable, that there were alternatives to the cycle of violence that consumed so many frontier communities. Martha's first trading session took place on a cold February morning in 1880, when a small band of Apache appeared at the edge of her property. David was away on a supply run to San Antonio, leaving Martha alone with their two young children. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a terrifying situation. A lone woman facing armed warriors with no backup and no escape route. But Martha had been preparing for this moment for months. She had observed the Apache from a distance, noting their clothing, their weapons, their horses. She had learned enough of their language to understand basic concepts like trade, peace, and mutual benefit. Most importantly, she had prepared trade goods that she knew would be valuable to people living a nomadic lifestyle. The lead Apache warrior, a man Martha estimated to be in his 50s, with scars that spoke of many battles, approached the trading window with the kind of caution that suggested he too understood the delicate nature of their interaction. This was a moment that could lead to profitable trade or deadly violence, depending on how both sides handled themselves. Martha opened the conversation by placing a bright red cloth on the window shelf, her signal for peaceful intentions. The Apache warrior responded by laying his rifle on the ground within sight but out of reach, his own signal that he came for trade rather than war. From that moment, both sides understood that they were engaged in diplomacy rather than conflict. What followed was a complex negotiation conducted in a mixture of broken Spanish, basic Apache words, and an elaborate system of gestures and symbols. Martha offered coffee, sugar, and metal tools, luxuries that were difficult for nomadic peoples to obtain. The Apache offered buffalo hides, beadwork, and information about outlaw activity in the area. But the most valuable thing exchanged that day wasn't goods or information. It was respect. Both sides demonstrated that they could see past their mutual fear and prejudice to recognize shared humanity. Martha learned that the Apache weren't mindless savages bent on destruction, but intelligent people trying to preserve their way of life in a changing world. The Apache learned that not all white settlers were land-hungry invaders determined to drive them from their ancestral territory. That first trading session established a pattern that continued for years. The Apache band would appear at Martha's trading window every few months, offering goods and information in exchange for supplies they couldn't easily obtain elsewhere. More importantly, they served as an early warning system, alerting Martha to threats from outlaw gangs, Mexican raiders, or even hostile Apache from other bands. The relationship wasn't without its tensions. There were moments when cultural misunderstandings nearly led to violence, times when external pressures, military campaigns, outlaw attacks on Apache camps, raids by hostile Apache on settler communities threatened to destroy the fragile trust that had been built. But the trading window provided a space where these tensions could be addressed through communication rather than violence. Martha's trading records, preserved in letters she wrote to relatives back east, show the remarkable scope of the commerce that flowed through her small window. Over the course of 5 years, she traded with Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and even Mexican vaqueros who crossed the border looking for supplies unavailable in their own communities. Her window became a neutral ground where traditional enemies could meet safely, conduct business, and sometimes even share information about mutual threats. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Martha's trading window was how it changed her understanding of the world around her. She learned that the savage wilderness she had feared was actually a complex network of communities, trade routes, and political relationships that had existed long before white settlers arrived. She discovered that survival on the frontier often depended more on understanding these relationships than on the firepower you could bring to bear. The information she gathered through her trading window proved invaluable when outlaw gangs threatened the area. The Apache had warned her about the Anderson gang 3 days before they struck other homesteads in the region, giving Martha time to prepare defenses and alert neighbors. When Mexican banditos crossed the border looking for easy targets, it was Comanche traders who provided Martha with detailed intelligence about their numbers, weapons, and likely routes, rifle rest windowsills and gun ports. But even the most successful diplomacy needed to be backed by the credible threat of force. Every frontier home was designed to serve as a potential fortress, with architectural features that allowed peaceful families to transform into deadly defenders at a moment's notice. The rifle rest windowsill was perhaps the most common defensive modification found in Texas frontier homes. What looked like simple wooden window frames were actually precision-engineered shooting platforms designed to provide maximum accuracy and protection for defenders. The basic principle was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of standard flat windowsills, frontier carpenters created sills with carved grooves that would cradle a rifle barrel at exactly the right angle for accurate shooting. The grooves were usually carved to fit specific weapons: a Winchester 1873, a Sharps rifle, whatever the family had available for defense. The result was a shooting platform that eliminated the wobble and uncertainty that came with handheld aiming. But the real sophistication came in the angles and positioning. Experienced frontier builders understood fields of fire, overlapping coverage, and the importance of creating crossfire zones that would trap attackers in deadly intersections of gunfire. They positioned rifle rest windows to cover every possible approach to the homestead, creating a defensive network that could be operated by a small number of trained defenders. The Garrett family homestead near El Paso represented the ultimate evolution of this concept. Every window in the house, and there were 12 of them, was equipped with custom rifle rests carved for different family members. Even young Billy Garrett, only 12 years old, had his own window equipped with a groove sized for a youth rifle that had been modified specifically for his smaller frame. But the Garrett system went beyond individual shooting positions. The family had created what amounted to a military-style fire control system, with predetermined fields of fire, ammunition caches positioned for easy resupply, and even a primitive communication system that allowed defenders at different windows to coordinate their actions. The engineering was remarkable. Each window was positioned to provide overlapping coverage with at least 2 others, ensuring that no attacker could approach the house without being exposed to multiple defenders. The rifle rests were carved at slightly different angles, creating a fan of intersecting fire zones that would be nearly impossible to navigate safely. More importantly, the Garrett family had practiced their defensive routine until it became second nature. Each family member knew their assigned position, their field of fire, and their role in the overall defensive plan. They had drilled ammunition resupply procedures, coordinated reloading schedules, and even developed hand signals that would allow silent communication during an attack. The system was tested in the summer of 1881 when a large gang of Mexican banditos decided that the prosperous Garrett Ranch would provide rich pickings for their cross-border raid. The banditos had intelligence suggesting that the Garrett family was wealthy but lightly defended, information that proved to be catastrophically wrong. The attack began just before dawn, with more than 20 mounted raiders approaching the Garrett homestead from multiple directions. From the banditos' perspective, this was a standard overwhelm and loot operation designed to capture or kill the family before they could organize effective resistance. Instead, they rode into what amounted to a military ambush. As soon as the raiders came within range, the entire Garrett family opened fire from their prepared positions, creating a devastating crossfire that caught the attackers completely off guard. The psychological impact was immediate. The banditos had expected to face a few frightened farmers armed with hunting rifles. Instead, they found themselves taking accurate, coordinated fire from multiple directions, with each shot precisely aimed to inflict maximum damage. The rifle rest windows allowed even the youngest Garrett children to shoot with deadly accuracy, turning what should have been easy victims into efficient killers. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes, but it was one of the most devastating defeats ever inflicted on a cross-border raiding party. When the smoke cleared, more than half the banditos were dead or wounded, and the survivors were fleeing back toward Mexico, thoroughly demoralized and desperate to escape what they perceived as a supernatural trap. But the Garrett family's victory was more than just a tactical success. It was a demonstration of how frontier families could use architectural innovation and military-style preparation to overcome seemingly impossible odds. Word of their victory spread throughout the region, creating a reputation that deterred future attacks and established the Garrett homestead as one of the most secure properties in West Texas. Weaponized wells with hidden chambers. Water was life on the Texas frontier, and controlling the water supply was often the key to controlling entire regions. But some frontier families turned their wells into more than just water sources. They became underground fortresses capable of protecting both the vital resource and the people who depended on it. The concept of the weaponized well represented some of the most sophisticated engineering found on the frontier. These weren't simple holes in the ground with buckets attached. They were complex defensive systems that could serve as storage facilities, observation posts, ammunition depots, and last resort refuges. The Patterson family, who homesteaded in the harsh desert country of West Texas, created what was probably the most elaborate well fortress system ever built by a frontier family. The desert environment made water critically important, but it also made the Patterson well a natural target for anyone who wanted to control or destroy their family's water supply. From the surface, the Patterson well looked completely normal. A stone-lined shaft about 4 feet in diameter, covered with a wooden lid and equipped with the standard rope and pulley system for drawing water. But what wasn't visible from above was that the well extended far beyond what was necessary for reaching water. The actual water table was reached at about 30 feet down, which would have been sufficient for a normal well. But the Patterson well continued down for another 20 feet, creating a large underground chamber that could serve multiple functions. This chamber was accessible through concealed handholds carved into the stone walls, invisible to casual observation, but allowing someone who knew the secret to climb down into the hidden space. But the real genius was in the multiple levels and false bottoms that the Patterson family had incorporated into their design. What appeared to be the bottom of the well was actually a wooden platform that could support the weight of people drawing water normally, but would collapse if multiple attackers tried to use the well simultaneously, or if someone tried to climb down to poison the water supply. Below this false bottom was the main defensive chamber, equipped with rifle ports that provided 360-degree coverage of the area around the well. Someone hiding in this chamber could observe everything happening above ground while remaining completely invisible and protected. More importantly, they could deliver devastating surprise fire against anyone who thought they had captured or controlled the well. The system included multiple storage areas carved into the sides of the well shaft, hidden behind removable stone panels. These chambers contained weapons, ammunition, food, and water, enough supplies to sustain a family for several weeks, if they had to take refuge in their underground fortress. But perhaps the most ingenious feature was the escape tunnel that connected the well chamber to the main house. This passage, barely large enough for a person to crawl through, allowed the family to move between the house and the well without being seen from above ground. They could evacuate to the well fortress if the house was under attack, or they could use the tunnel to launch surprise attacks from behind enemies who thought they had the family trapped. The Patterson well system was tested during the brutal drought of 1883, when water became so scarce that armed gangs began targeting isolated wells throughout West Texas. These water pirates represented a new kind of frontier threat, organized groups that controlled scarce resources and demanded payment from anyone who wanted access to them. The gang that targeted the Patterson well was one of the largest and most ruthless operating in the region. Led by a former Union Army officer named Caldwell, they had successfully captured or destroyed more than a dozen wells, forcing frontier families to either pay tribute or abandon their homesteads. Caldwell's gang approached the Patterson property with the confidence of professionals who had never been successfully opposed. Their standard tactic was to surround the well, capture or kill anyone trying to defend it, and then either demand payment for access to the water or destroy the well to eliminate competition for scarce resources in the area. But the Patterson family had been preparing for this confrontation for months. When lookouts spotted Caldwell's gang approaching, the family implemented their well defense plan with military precision. Within minutes, all 5 family members had disappeared into their underground fortress, leaving no trace above ground except for an apparently abandoned homestead. Caldwell's gang occupied the area around the well, expecting to find a family cowering in their house or perhaps already fled to seek help from distant neighbors. Instead, they found what appeared to be a deserted property with an undefended well that seemed to offer easy access to the water they wanted to control. The trap was sprung when half of Caldwell's men gathered around the well to examine their prize. The false bottom mechanism activated under their combined weight, dropping 4 of the water pirates into the spike-filled pit that the Patterson family had prepared for exactly this situation. The psychological impact was devastating. The well itself had seemingly come alive to defend its water, but the Patterson family wasn't finished. From their hidden positions within the well chamber, they began delivering accurate rifle fire through the gun ports they had carved into the stone walls. From Caldwell's perspective, his men were being shot by the well itself, with gunfire coming from impossible angles and invisible enemies picking off his gang one by one. The battle lasted most of the day, with the surviving members of Caldwell's gang trying desperately to locate and attack enemies they couldn't see. They fired into the well, threw dynamite down the shaft, even tried to fill it with brush, and set it on fire. But the Patterson family's engineering was too sophisticated to be defeated by such crude tactics. The well chamber was designed to withstand exactly these kinds of attacks. The stone walls were thick enough to stop rifle bullets. The ventilation system prevented smoke from building up to dangerous levels, and the multiple exit routes meant that the family could escape if the situation became truly desperate. By sunset, Caldwell's gang had been reduced from 12 men to 3 survivors who were wounded, demoralized, and desperate to escape what they perceived as a supernatural trap. They fled the area, spreading stories about the haunted well that fought back against those who tried to steal its water. Chimney platforms and smoke signals. The chimney was more than just a way to vent smoke from frontier homes. It was the highest point on most homesteads, providing a natural watchtower and communication center for families who understood how to exploit its potential. The basic concept was to modify the interior structure of the chimney to allow access to an observation platform near the top, just below the point where smoke would exit. This required careful engineering to ensure that the platform didn't interfere with the chimney's primary function, but it provided defenders with an elevated position that could see for miles in every direction. The Thompson family near Amarillo created what was probably the most sophisticated chimney fortress system in Texas. Their chimney appeared completely normal from the outside, a tall brick structure that efficiently vented smoke from their fireplace and provided a visual landmark that could be seen from miles away. But inside the brick walls was a complex system of platforms, ladders, and hidden chambers that turned the chimney into a multi-level military installation. The construction required exceptional skill. The chimney had to function normally as a smoke vent, while also providing structural support for multiple platforms and storage areas. The Thompson family worked with a master mason who understood both conventional chimney construction and the unique requirements of their defensive modifications. The lowest platform was accessed through a concealed opening in the fireplace itself, hidden behind removable bricks that appeared to be permanent parts of the chimney structure. This platform, about 10 feet above the main floor of the house, provided storage for weapons and ammunition while remaining invisible to anyone in the main room. The middle platform, reached by iron rungs set into the chimney walls, offered the first real observation position. From this height, a defender could see the entire area around the homestead, while remaining completely concealed from ground-level observation. Gun ports carved into the brick walls allowed accurate fire in all directions, creating a sniper's nest that could dominate the entire property. But the highest platform was the real masterpiece. Positioned just below the chimney opening, it provided observation capabilities that extended for miles across the flat Texas plains. From this position, the Thompson family could spot approaching riders when they were still hours away, giving them time to prepare defenses or to send warnings to neighboring homesteads. More importantly, the highest platform served as a communication center. The Thompson family had developed an elaborate system of smoke signals that could convey complex information to other homesteads throughout the region. Different combinations of smoke puffs could indicate the number of approaching riders, their apparent intentions, their direction of travel, and the level of threat they represented. The smoke signal system represented some of the most sophisticated frontier communication technology of the era. The Thompson family had learned techniques from both Native American tribes and military signal corps, adapting them for use by frontier families who needed to coordinate defensive activities across vast distances. The basic principle was to control the smoke output by manipulating the chimney damper and by adding specific materials to the fire. Green branches produced thick white smoke that was visible for miles. Oiled rags created black smoke that contrasted sharply against the sky. By controlling the timing and duration of these smoke bursts, the Thompson family could send detailed messages to anyone who understood their code. But the real sophistication came in the message content. The Thompson family had developed a vocabulary of smoke signals that could convey not just basic warnings, but detailed intelligence about threats, requests for assistance, and even coordination of multi-family defensive actions. A series of 3 white puffs followed by 2 black ones might mean large gang approaching from the east, request immediate assistance. 4 black puffs in rapid succession could mean attack in progress. All families implement defensive plans immediately. The system was tested during the spring of 1882, when a large outlaw gang began working their way across the Texas Panhandle, hitting isolated homesteads with a combination of overwhelming force and military precision. The gang was led by a former Confederate cavalry officer who understood tactics and coordination, making them far more dangerous than typical frontier outlaws. The Thompson family's early warning system detected the gang when they were still more than 10 miles away, giving them time to implement their defensive plan and to alert other families in the area. From the highest chimney platform, Young Samuel Thompson spotted the dust cloud raised by nearly 20 mounted riders moving at speed across the prairie. Within minutes, the Thompson chimney was sending out smoke signals that alerted homesteads throughout a 50-mile radius. The message was simple but urgent. Large, hostile force approaching. All families implement maximum defensive measures immediately. The response was immediate and coordinated. Families throughout the region began their own smoke signals, confirming receipt of the warning and reporting their defensive status. Within 2 hours, the Thompson family had organized a network of mutually supporting defensive positions that turned the scattered homesteads into a coordinated military force. But the chimney platform's value went beyond communication. When the outlaw gang finally reached the Thompson homestead, they found themselves under accurate rifle fire from an elevated position they hadn't anticipated. The chimney sniper's nest allowed the Thompson family to engage the outlaws at ranges and angles that made it nearly impossible for the attackers to return effective fire. The psychological impact was devastating. The outlaws had expected to overwhelm a single family through superior numbers and firepower. Instead, they found themselves taking accurate fire from multiple directions, with their movements observed and reported by a communication system they didn't understand and couldn't counter. The battle lasted through the night, but by dawn, the outlaw gang had been reduced to less than half their original strength. The survivors fled the area, thoroughly demoralized and convinced that they had stumbled into some kind of military trap rather than attacking an isolated frontier family. Bulletproof Bible corners. Religion and violence were never far apart on the Texas frontier, where families prayed for peace, but prepared for war with equal fervor. The family Bible, that massive leather-bound tome that served as both spiritual guide and family record, could also serve a more immediate purpose as personal armor in a world where bullets flew more often than prayers were answered. The concept was based on simple physics and practical experience. A large family Bible, especially one of the massive pulpit Bibles that were common in the 19th century, contained hundreds of pages of densely packed paper. Civil War veterans had learned that such books could stop pistol bullets and even some rifle rounds, and this knowledge quickly spread to frontier families who understood that survival often depended on using whatever materials were available. But frontier families took this concept far beyond simple improvised armor. They created what amounted to fortified Bible corners, areas of their homes where thick books were positioned to provide cover during firefights, while still appearing to serve their normal religious and educational functions. The Wilson family near Houston created perhaps the most sophisticated Bible corner system in Texas. Their main room featured a prominent display of religious books arranged on specially built shelves that appeared to be simple furniture, but were actually carefully engineered defensive positions. The centerpiece was a massive family Bible, nearly 4 inches thick, and bound in leather, that had been treated to make it even more resistant to projectiles. But this Bible had been modified in ways that would have shocked the faithful. The interior pages had been carefully hollowed out to create a hidden compartment just large enough to hold a loaded Derringer and several spare cartridges. The positioning of the Bible and its supporting books was calculated with military precision. The shelving system provided cover for the entire corner of the room, creating a defensive position where someone could take shelter while still having clear fields of fire toward all the main entrances to the house. The books themselves were arranged in overlapping layers that would stop most small arms fire while appearing to be nothing more than a well-organized religious library. But the Wilson family's Bible corner served purposes beyond immediate defense. The hollow Bible could conceal not just weapons, but important documents, money, and other valuables that needed to be protected from thieves. More importantly, the religious display served a psychological function, presenting the family as God-fearing Christians who might be more likely to show mercy to attackers who surrendered. The system was tested during a home invasion in the winter of 1878, when three outlaws broke into the Wilson house expecting to find a peaceful, religious family who could be easily intimidated into revealing the location of hidden valuables. Instead, they found themselves facing Mary Wilson, a preacher's daughter who understood both scripture and gunfire with equal clarity. When the outlaws demanded that she tell them where her husband kept his money, Mary calmly walked to the Bible corner and began reading from scripture, specifically passages about the righteous defending themselves against the wicked. The outlaws were initially amused by what they saw as religious fanaticism in the face of mortal danger. But their amusement turned to shock when Mary reached into her hollowed-out Bible and produced a loaded derringer, which she used to put a bullet into the chest of the gang's leader at point-blank range. The psychological impact was devastating. The outlaws had come to rob a Christian family and found themselves shot by someone who had literally drawn a gun from the Bible itself. From their perspective, they were facing some kind of divine intervention rather than simple human resistance. But Mary Wilson wasn't finished. Using the Bible corner's defensive advantages, she was able to take cover behind her book collection while engaging the surviving outlaws with both her derringer and a rifle that had been concealed behind a particularly large collection of hymn books. The thick volumes provided excellent protection from returned fire, while the positioning allowed her to dominate the entire main room of the house. The firefight lasted until dawn, with Mary using her intimate knowledge of the Bible corner's defensive features to outmaneuver opponents who had expected to overwhelm a helpless woman. By sunrise, 2 of the 3 outlaws were dead, and the survivor was begging for mercy while bleeding from multiple wounds. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Bible corner defense was how it changed the community's understanding of the relationship between faith and violence on the frontier. Mary Wilson's victory became legendary throughout the region, creating a new model of Christian resistance that combined prayer with practical preparation for violence. The integration of diplomacy and defense. What made these defensive and communication systems truly remarkable was how they worked together to create a comprehensive survival strategy that went far beyond simple violence. The frontier families who thrived understood that survival required a delicate balance of diplomacy, communication, preparation, and, when necessary, overwhelming force. The Indian trading window allowed for peaceful commerce and intelligence gathering, but it was always backed by the implicit threat of the rifle rest windows positioned to cover the entire trading area. The chimney communication system provided early warning of threats, but it was integrated with defensive positions that could turn that intelligence into tactical advantage. Even the Bible corner represented this integration of approaches. It provided spiritual comfort and moral guidance, but it also concealed the tools necessary for physical survival in a violent world. The families who created these systems understood that faith without firepower was often fatal on the frontier, but that firepower without moral purpose was the path to becoming the very predators they sought to protect themselves against. The psychological impact of these integrated systems went far beyond their immediate tactical value. They created a mindset among frontier families that refused to accept helplessness as an option. These people understood that survival required constant vigilance, careful preparation, and the ability to see opportunity in the most unlikely circumstances. They turned isolation into advantage by creating communication networks that spanned hundreds of miles. They turned apparent weakness into strength by concealing deadly capabilities behind facades of innocence. They turned their homes into fortresses while maintaining the appearance of simple domestic spaces. Most importantly, they created a model of frontier survival that influenced American culture for generations. The idea that ordinary citizens could protect themselves through intelligence, preparation, and community cooperation became a fundamental part of the American character. the belief that free people could defend their liberty through their own efforts rather than depending on distant authorities for protection. These strange and forgotten features of frontier homes represent more than just historical curiosities. They embody a philosophy of self-reliance and community cooperation that helped create the American nation. They remind us that freedom isn't free, that security requires vigilance, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept defeat as an option. Porter, the atmosphere of Texas, frontier life. Now that we've explored the hidden weapons and secret defenses that frontier families built into their homes, it's time to understand what daily life actually felt like inside these fortress houses. Because living with such elaborate defensive systems wasn't just about the mechanics of survival. It was about the profound psychological impact of knowing that your breakfast table might conceal a trap door, that your evening prayers might be interrupted by gunfire, and that your children's bedtime stories often included detailed instructions on which floorboards to avoid and which secret panels to open when the shooting started. The sights and sounds inside a cabin. Step inside a typical Texas frontier home on a quiet evening in 1875, and your senses would be overwhelmed by an experience completely alien to modern life. The first thing that would hit you wouldn't be what you saw, but what you smelled. And it was nothing like the sanitized, air-freshened environment we take for granted today. The dominant scent was wood smoke, not the pleasant campfire aroma you might expect, but something thicker, more complex. It was smoke from mesquite, oak, and whatever other wood the family had been able to gather, mixed with the greasy smell of bacon fat that had been used and reused until it had developed its own personality. Underneath that was the earthy, organic smell of unwashed human bodies. Because bathing was a luxury that most frontier families indulged in once a week if they were prosperous, once a month if they were not. But there were other smells too, ones that told the story of a life lived on the edge of survival. Gun oil, carefully applied to weapons that were cleaned and maintained with religious devotion, because a jammed rifle could mean death. The metallic scent of blood, because frontier families butchered their own livestock and weren't squeamish about the realities of where meat came from. The acrid smell of black powder that seemed to hang in the air permanently, a reminder that violence was never more than a heartbeat away. Then there were the sounds, a symphony of frontier life that created a backdrop completely different from anything we experience today. The constant creak of wooden beams expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. The scratch and scurry of mice in the walls, because keeping rodents out of frontier homes was nearly impossible. The occasional thump of something larger, maybe a rat, maybe a snake, maybe something that had crawled under the floorboards, seeking shelter. Outside, the night sounds of Texas created their own haunting music. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices rising and falling in harmonies that could raise the hair on your neck. Owls called from the darkness, their cries sometimes mixing with the more distant sounds of cattle lowing or horses stamping and snorting in their corral. And underneath it all was the wind, the endless, restless Texas wind that whispered through cracks in the walls and rattled the wooden shutters like fingers tapping for entrance. But it was the light that really defined the atmosphere inside a frontier cabin. Forget electric switches or even reliable gas lamps. Most frontier families lived by the dim, flickering illumination of oil lamps, candles, or simply the glow from their fireplace. The light was never steady, never bright enough to read comfortably, and always accompanied by shadows that danced and shifted with every air current. This uncertain lighting created an atmosphere of constant visual uncertainty. Corners remained dark and mysterious. Objects seemed to change shape as the flames flickered. Even familiar furniture could look threatening when glimpsed through the shifting patterns of light and shadow. Children who grew up in this environment developed almost supernatural ability to navigate in near darkness, but they also developed a heightened awareness of their surroundings that stayed with them for life. The furniture itself told the story of frontier priorities. Every piece served multiple functions. A chest wasn't just for storage, it was a potential barricade. A table wasn't just for meals, it was a shooting platform. Even the rocking chair by the fireplace might conceal weapons or ammunition in its hollow arms, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. Sarah McKinney, who homesteaded with her husband near Fort Worth, described the atmosphere inside their cabin in letters to her sister back in Pennsylvania. "The very air seems to whisper of danger," she wrote. "Every shadow might conceal a threat. Every sound might be the first warning of attack. We live like mice in a house full of cats, always listening, always ready to run or fight." But Sarah's letters also revealed something else, the strange comfort that came from being so thoroughly prepared for disaster. "There is peace in knowing that we are not helpless," she continued. "Our home may look humble, but it is a fortress. Our family may seem vulnerable, but we are armed and ready. The outlaws and savages may be numerous, but we have turned our very dwelling into a weapon that fights beside us." The evening routine in a frontier home was a carefully choreographed dance between domestic normalcy and military preparedness. Dinner might be beans and cornbread served on simple wooden plates, but the family would discuss the day's observations, who had been seen on the horizon, whether the horses seemed nervous about something, what the neighbor's smoke signals had indicated earlier in the day. Children would help clear the table while secretly checking that hidden weapons were in their proper places. The mother might appear to be simply tidying up, while actually ensuring that escape routes were clear and that emergency supplies were properly positioned. The father would bank the fire for the night while loading rifles and positioning them within easy reach of the family's defensive stations. But even these preparations were conducted with an eye toward maintaining the appearance of normal domestic life. Frontier families understood that their survival often depended on seeming harmless to casual observers, while being ready to unleash devastating violence against serious threats. The harsh environment and home adaptations. Living in these defensive fortress homes meant adapting to an environment that was hostile in ways that went far beyond human threats. The Texas climate was a constant enemy that could kill as efficiently as any outlaw gang, and frontier homes had to be designed to protect their occupants from nature as well as from human predators. The summer heat was perhaps the most immediate challenge. In the flat plains of Central and South Texas, temperatures could reach 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, if you could find any shade. Frontier homes had to provide protection from this heat, while still allowing for the constant vigilance that survival required. Most homes were built with thick log or adobe walls that provided insulation against the temperature extremes, but these walls also had to accommodate the gun ports, observation windows, and hidden passages that the family's defensive plan required. The result was often a complex system of double walls with air gaps that provided both thermal insulation and space for concealed weapons and escape routes. Windows were small and positioned strategically, not just for defensive purposes, but to minimize heat gain while maximizing cross-ventilation. The rifle rest windowsills served the dual purpose of providing shooting platforms and creating air currents that helped cool the interior during the brutal summer months. Floors were often made of packed earth covered with wooden planks, creating natural insulation while providing easy access to the hidden chambers and tunnels that were essential components of the home's defensive system. The trapdoors and hidden passages actually helped with climate control, allowing hot air to escape through underground tunnels while drawing cooler air up from the earth. But winter presented its own challenges. Texas winters could be surprisingly harsh, with northern storms bringing temperatures below freezing and winds that could cut through any shelter. The same defensive features that provided protection from human enemies had to be modified to deal with cold, snow, and ice. Fireplaces and chimneys served triple duty, heating the home, providing cooking facilities, and serving as observation towers and communication centers. The chimney platforms that were essential for defensive purposes also had to be designed to function safely during winter weather, when ice and snow could make climbing the interior rungs dangerous or impossible. The false walls and hidden chambers that provided concealment during attacks also served as emergency shelter during extreme weather events. If a blizzard made it impossible to maintain a fire in the main room, families could retreat to their hidden spaces, which retained heat more effectively due to their smaller size and earth-surrounded construction. Food storage presented particular challenges in the extreme Texas climate. The root cellars that served as panic rooms also had to function as food preservation systems, maintaining constant cool temperatures even during the hottest summers. The hidden chambers built into wells and underground tunnels provided additional storage space that was protected from both weather and human threats. Water was always a concern, but it became critical during the frequent droughts that plagued Texas during this period. The weaponized wells that protected the water supply from human enemies also had to be designed to maximize water conservation and to provide access even during extended dry periods. The Garrett family near El Paso dealt with these environmental challenges by creating what amounted to an underground city beneath their homestead. Their system of tunnels, chambers, and hidden passages provided not just defensive advantages, but also climate-controlled living space that could be used during extreme weather events. During the devastating drought of 1881, when surface temperatures reached lethal levels for weeks at a time, the Garrett family spent most of their daylight hours in their underground network. They emerged only at night to tend their livestock and to maintain their surface defensive positions. Their hidden chambers remained comfortably cool, even when the surface temperature exceeded 120 degrees. The family's role in the defensive system. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these frontier fortress homes was how they transformed traditional family roles and relationships. Every family member, from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent, became an integral part of a military-style defensive organization that could respond to threats with coordination and efficiency that would have impressed professional soldiers. Children grew up understanding that their survival depended on their ability to follow complex emergency procedures without question or hesitation. They were drilled on escape routes, defensive positions, and emergency protocols from the time they could walk. But this wasn't just about memorizing procedures. It was about developing the kind of instantaneous response capabilities that could mean the difference between life and death when seconds counted. Mary Catherine Henderson, daughter of the Abilene Hendersons we met earlier, was only 8 years old when she experienced her first real attack. But her response demonstrated the kind of training that frontier children received as a matter of course. When her brother Samuel spotted riders approaching at dawn, Mary Catherine immediately implemented the family's emergency protocol. Without being told, she gathered her younger siblings and moved them to their assigned positions in the root cellar panic room. She checked that their emergency supplies were in place, verified that the hidden rifle ports were clear of obstructions, and then took her own position at an observation post, where she could monitor the approaches to the house while remaining completely concealed. When the shooting started, Mary Catherine served as a spotter for her father, using a system of hand signals they had practiced to indicate the positions and movements of the attacking outlaws. Her information allowed Tom Henderson to direct his fire with deadly accuracy, picking off attackers who thought they were hidden from observation. But Mary Catherine's role went beyond passive observation. When one of the outlaws tried to circle around to attack the cellar entrance, she was ready with a loaded pistol that her father had modified specifically for her smaller hands. Her shot, delivered at a range of less than 10 feet, probably saved her entire family's life. Women on the frontier took on roles that would have been unthinkable in more settled areas. They weren't just wives and mothers. They were military partners, intelligence analysts, and sometimes the primary defenders of their homes and families. The elaborate defensive systems built into frontier homes required operators who could think tactically, respond instantly to changing situations, and fight with deadly effectiveness when diplomacy failed. Sarah Patterson, who managed a ranch near San Antonio while her husband traveled on business, became legendary for her ability to coordinate multi-family defensive operations during outlaw raids. Using the smoke signal system installed in her chimney, she could organize resistance efforts across a 50-mile radius, turning scattered homesteads into mutually supporting military positions. But Sarah's real expertise was in psychological warfare. She understood that defeating frontier enemies often required breaking their morale rather than simply killing them. During one attack by Mexican bandidos, she used her hidden speakers and concealed weapons to create the illusion that her ranch was defended by a much larger force than was actually present. The bandidos found themselves taking fire from multiple directions, with voices shouting orders in several different languages, creating confusion about who they were actually fighting. Sarah had recruited neighboring families to participate in the deception, using her communication system to coordinate a complex psychological operation that convinced the attackers they were facing a military unit rather than a handful of frontier families. Even elderly family members were integrated into the defensive system. Grandparents who were too old for active combat served as lookouts, communication operators, and ammunition handlers. Their experience and wisdom were invaluable for recognizing threats and coordinating responses that maximized the family's defensive advantages. Nighttime in old Texas. As darkness settled over the Texas plains, frontier families entered the most dangerous period of their daily cycle. The vast majority of attacks on homesteads occurred under cover of darkness, when raiders could approach undetected, and when the isolation of frontier life was most complete. The evening routine in a frontier home was a carefully orchestrated preparation for potential violence. As the sun set, families would implement what they called battening down, a systematic process of securing their home and preparing for the possibility that they might have to fight for their lives before morning. Oil lamps would be positioned strategically, not just to provide light for evening activities, but to create sight lines that would allow defenders to identify targets while avoiding being silhouetted themselves. The main room might appear to be peacefully lit for family activities, but the lighting was actually designed to provide tactical advantages if shooting started. Weapons would be cleaned, loaded, and positioned at key defensive locations throughout the house. But this wasn't done with military formality. It was integrated into normal evening activities. A father might clean his rifle while listening to his daughter read from a school book. A mother might check the loads in her pistol while mending clothes by lamplight. Children might practice their letters while secretly verifying that ammunition supplies were properly stocked. The family would gather around their fireplace for what appeared to be normal evening activities: reading, conversation, simple games, or music. But every family member would be mentally rehearsing their role in the defensive plan, reviewing escape routes and emergency procedures, and listening for the sounds that might indicate approaching trouble. The night sounds of the Texas frontier created their own psychological environment. Families learned to distinguish between normal sounds and those that might indicate danger. The natural night music of coyotes, owls, and insects provided a baseline that experienced frontier dwellers could read like a book. When that natural symphony was interrupted or changed, it often meant that something was moving through the darkness, something that might be a threat. But the frontier night also provided its own forms of comfort and beauty. Without the light pollution of modern civilization, the night sky blazed with stars in a display that was breathtaking in its intensity. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, and planets were visible to the naked eye with startling clarity. Families would often spend their evening hours on their porches, the real ones, not the collapsible suicide porches, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds while maintaining their vigilant watch for threats. Children learn to identify constellations and to use them for navigation, skills that might save their lives if they ever had to travel across the prairie at night. The seasonal rhythms of frontier life created their own patterns of preparation and relaxation. Summer nights were often spent outdoors, where families could catch any breath of cooling air while maintaining their watch for threats. But summer was also when most attacks occurred, because the weather made long-distance travel easier for outlaw gangs and raiding parties. Winter nights were spent huddled around the fireplace, but even indoor activities were conducted with constant awareness of defensive needs. Families would tell stories, sing songs, and play simple games, but they would also use the time to maintain their weapons, practice their emergency procedures, and plan improvements to their defensive systems. Margaret Collins, who lived with her family near Dallas, described their evening routine in her diary. "We gather around the fire like any Christian family, but Papa's rifle leans against his chair, loaded and ready. Mama's pistol rests on the mantel within easy reach. Even little Thomas knows which floorboard conceals the ammunition, and baby Sarah has been taught to crawl to the root cellar at the first sign of trouble." But Margaret's diary also revealed the strange comfort that came from being so thoroughly prepared. "There is peace in our preparations," she wrote. "We fear nothing because we are ready for everything. Our home is our fortress, our family is our army, and our faith is our foundation. Let the outlaws and savages come. They will find us poor prey, indeed." The quality of light inside frontier homes created its own unique atmosphere. Oil lamps and candles provided illumination that was warm but dim, creating pools of light surrounded by areas of deep shadow. This lighting served tactical purposes. It was difficult for outside observers to count the number of people inside or to identify defensive positions. But it also created an intimate, almost mystical environment for family activities. Reading was a precious activity, reserved for family members who had mastered the skill and for books valuable enough to justify the expense of lamp oil. Most frontier families owned only a few books, usually the family Bible, perhaps a farmer's almanac, and maybe one or two novels that had been carefully preserved and passed down through generations. When reading occurred, it was often a communal activity, with one family member reading aloud while others worked on evening chores. Children would listen to Bible stories while cleaning weapons or practicing emergency procedures. Adults would discuss the day's events while maintaining weapons and planning the next day's activities. The fireplace served as more than just a source of heat and light. It was the spiritual and practical center of frontier home life. Families gathered around the fire for meals, conversations, prayers, and planning sessions. But even these peaceful activities were conducted with constant awareness that the same fire that provided comfort could also serve as a weapon, that the chimney above them might conceal armed defenders, and that the fireplace itself might be the entrance to escape tunnels that could save their lives. The psychological impact of constant preparedness. Living in a home designed for warfare created psychological effects that influenced every aspect of frontier family life. Children who grew up sleeping over hidden escape tunnels, eating at tables that concealed weapon caches, and playing in rooms where every piece of furniture might be a disguised weapon, developed a unique worldview that combined constant vigilance with deep appreciation for the security their preparations provided. These children learned to see their environment differently than kids who grew up in more settled areas. They understood mechanical systems, defensive tactics, and survival techniques that most adults in civilized areas never mastered. They could identify threats at long distances, navigate complex terrain in darkness, and operate sophisticated weapons with deadly accuracy. But they also developed emotional resilience that helped them cope with the constant stress of frontier life. They understood that preparation was the antidote to fear, that knowledge was power, and that family cooperation could overcome almost any challenge. The elaborate defensive systems their parents built weren't just physical protection. They were confidence builders that allowed children to grow up feeling secure despite living in one of the most dangerous environments in American history. The role of women in these defensive systems was particularly remarkable. Frontier women weren't protected dependents. They were full military partners who often took primary responsibility for home defense while their husbands were away on business. Women like Martha Stevenson and Rebecca Martinez became legendary for their ability to operate complex defensive systems, coordinate multi-family resistance efforts, and fight off attacks by superior numbers of armed men. These women developed skills that would have impressed professional soldiers. They could shoot with deadly accuracy, operate mechanical systems under extreme stress, and make tactical decisions that often meant the difference between life and death for entire families. But they also maintained the domestic skills that kept their families fed, clothed, and spiritually grounded in the face of constant danger. The integration of military and domestic activities created a unique culture where violence and nurturing coexisted in ways that seem almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. A mother might spend her morning teaching her daughter to read from the Bible, then spend her afternoon teaching the same daughter to reload a rifle under combat conditions. A father might help his son with arithmetic problems in the evening, then drill him on escape routes and defensive positions before bedtime. Seasonal rhythms and defensive cycles. The Texas frontier operated according to seasonal rhythms that determined not just agricultural activities, but also the timing and intensity of defensive preparations. Each season brought its own challenges and opportunities, its own threats and advantages, and frontier families adapted their defensive systems accordingly. Spring was the season of hope and vulnerability. The harsh winter was ending, making travel easier for both legitimate visitors and unwelcome guests. Outlaw gangs that had spent the winter in hiding began moving again, looking for isolated homesteads that might have accumulated valuable supplies during the cold months. But spring was also when frontier families emerged from their winter defensive postures, cleaning and repairing their homes and preparing for the growing season. The Hartley family near Austin developed a comprehensive spring security protocol that reflected the unique challenges of this transitional season. As soon as the weather began to warm, they would conduct a complete inspection of all their defensive systems, checking that hidden weapons were properly maintained, ensuring that escape tunnels hadn't been damaged by winter weather, and testing all mechanical systems to ensure they would function when needed. But spring preparation also meant expanding their defensive perimeter. During winter, the Hartley family focused their security efforts on their immediate living spaces. But as the weather improved and outdoor activities became possible again, they had to create defensive systems that could protect them while they worked in their fields, tended their livestock, and conducted the business of frontier farming. This required creating what amounted to an outdoor fortress system, with defensive positions built into barn lofts, concealed rifle pits dug into strategic locations around the property, and communication systems that would allow workers in the fields to coordinate with defenders in the main house if trouble appeared. Summer was the season of maximum danger. The hot, dry weather made long-distance travel easier for raiders, while the same conditions made it harder for frontier families to maintain constant vigilance. The heat was debilitating, making it difficult to wear the heavy clothing needed for protection while working outdoors, and the extreme temperatures made it dangerous to spend extended periods in the underground chambers and tunnels that were essential components of most defensive systems. The Johnson family near Houston dealt with summer security challenges by creating what they called their hot weather protocol. During the most extreme heat, family members would take shifts underground in their hidden chambers, maintaining observation and defensive readiness while staying cool enough to function effectively. The underground spaces provided natural air conditioning, remaining comfortable even when surface temperatures became lethal. But summer also provided opportunities for offensive operations against threats. The heat and drought that made life difficult for frontier families also affected outlaw gangs and raiding parties. Groups that might seem formidable during cooler weather could be reduced to desperate, water-starved bands that were vulnerable to families who had prepared adequate supplies and defensive positions. Fall was the season of harvest and preparation. When frontier families worked frantically to gather and preserve enough food to survive the winter, while also preparing their defensive systems for the challenges that cold weather would bring. This was when many families conducted their most extensive modifications to their homes, adding new defensive features and improving existing systems based on lessons learned during the previous year's threat season. Winter was the season of siege. Snow and cold made travel difficult for raiders, but they also trapped frontier families in their homes for months at a time. The defensive systems that had been designed for quick responses and rapid movement had to be adapted for extended isolation and the possibility of prolonged attacks by enemies who might be willing to wait for their victims to run out of supplies. The Patterson family near Dallas created what they called their Winter Fortress Protocol, designed to allow them to survive in their underground defensive systems for months if necessary. They stockpiled food, fuel, and ammunition in their hidden chambers, created redundant water supplies in case their main well was compromised, and even established communication systems that would allow them to coordinate with other families during extended emergencies. Community networks and mutual defense. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these frontier defensive systems was how they evolved from individual family preparations into community-wide networks that could coordinate resistance efforts across hundreds of square miles. Families who had started by building hidden panic rooms and secret escape tunnels eventually created communication and mutual support systems that turned scattered homesteads into fortified settlements capable of defending entire regions. The smoke signal networks that began with individual families sending simple warnings evolved into sophisticated communication systems that could relay complex intelligence across vast distances. Families developed standardized signal codes that allowed them to share detailed information about threat levels, enemy movements, and defensive coordination. The Henderson family's chimney near Abilene became the central hub for a communication network that connected more than 30 homesteads across a 1,000-square-mile area. Their elevated position and sophisticated smoke signal equipment allowed them to relay messages between families who were too far apart to communicate directly, creating a frontier version of a military communication network. But the community networks went beyond simple communication. Families began coordinating their defensive preparations, sharing intelligence about threats, and even creating mutual support agreements that allowed them to combine their resources when facing major dangers. When the Great Apache War Party of 1882 moved through central Texas, the response was immediate and coordinated. Families throughout the region implemented their defensive protocols simultaneously, creating a network of mutually supporting fortresses that presented the war party with a completely unexpected level of organized resistance. The Apache, who had expected to find scattered, defenseless homesteads, instead encountered what amounted to a distributed military force. Every homestead they approached was already prepared for their arrival, with families hidden in defensive positions and ready to deliver coordinated fire from concealed locations. The psychological impact on the war party was devastating. They had come to raid isolated families and found themselves facing what appeared to be a military campaign designed specifically to counter their tactics. After losing more than half their number in a series of failed attacks on what they had expected to be easy targets, the Apache withdrew from the region and never returned in force. The success of the community defensive network demonstrated that frontier families had created something far more sophisticated than individual survival systems. They had developed a form of distributed warfare that allowed ordinary settlers to defeat professional raiders through superior preparation, coordination, and tactical innovation. The end of an era. By the 1890s, the age of the fortress homestead was coming to an end. The arrival of the railroad brought not just faster transportation and better communication, but also more effective law enforcement and military protection. The Texas Rangers had become a professional force capable of pursuing outlaws across vast distances. The Indian Wars were winding down as Native American tribes were forced onto reservations. The open range was being divided into fenced ranches that were easier to patrol and defend. The strange and ingenious defensive features that had been essential for survival were gradually abandoned or forgotten. Root cellar panic rooms were converted back to simple food storage. Hidden weapons caches were emptied and their concealed compartments used for storing household goods. Escape tunnels were sealed or allowed to collapse. But the families who had lived through the fortress era carried their experiences forward into the new century. The children who had grown up sleeping over hidden ammunition supplies became the adults who insisted on strong locks and sturdy construction in their new homes. The women who had fought off outlaw gangs with chamber pot bombs became the mothers who taught their daughters that self-reliance and careful preparation were the foundations of security. The defensive innovations of the Texas frontier influenced American architecture and culture in ways that are still visible today. The emphasis on security features in home design, the integration of storage and defensive considerations, and the belief that ordinary citizens should be prepared to defend themselves all trace their roots back to the fortress homesteads of the 1870s and 1880s. As you lie in your comfortable modern bed tonight, surrounded by the security systems and protective technologies that we take for granted, remember the frontier families who created the first versions of these innovations. They turned their homes into fortresses, not because they loved violence, but because they loved their families more than they feared their enemies. Their strange and forgotten defensive features tell a story of human ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds, of ordinary people who refused to accept helplessness as their fate, and of families who understood that freedom requires the willingness to fight for it. They created homes that could think, trap, and kill, because they understood that in a world without law, justice often came from the barrel of a gun hidden behind a false wall or beneath a kitchen floorboard. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you live in a world made safer by the courage and creativity of those who came before us, who turned their humble homes into fortresses and their domestic routines into military operations, all in service of a simple but profound goal: protecting the people they loved in a land where love itself was an act of defiance against a hostile world. The wind still blows across the Texas plains, rustling through the grass where those forgotten homesteads once stood. The stars still shine with the same brilliant intensity that guided frontier families through their darkest nights. And somewhere in the whisper of that eternal wind, you can still hear the echo of their determination, the sound of ordinary people who built extraordinary defenses and proved that the human spirit, properly prepared and cleverly applied, could overcome any threat the frontier might send their way.